$3,000. That's what Silas Vane put on a man's head because that man dared to own something Vane wanted. Not because Wyatt Mercer had stolen anything. Not because he'd broken any law. But because Wyatt had built something on land Vane had already decided belonged to him and refused to sell when the offer came with a threat attached. So Vane did what powerful men always do when words don't work. He paid someone else to make the problem disappear. By the time Dane Rourke pushed through the doors of the Dust Devil Saloon, with 2 killers walking behind him, the bounty had already been raised to $5,000. Vane wasn't just buying a death, he was buying a message, and Wyatt Mercer, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, had known they were coming since before he'd ever sat down. If you've ever been the kind of person who minds their own business and still ended up in somebody else's crosshairs, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackwater Ridge and find out what kind of man sits still while 3 killers walk through the door. The Dust Devil Saloon had a smell to it that most people stopped noticing after their first week in Blackwater Ridge. Sawdust and spilled beer, and something underneath that old wood soaking up years of smoke and argument and sweat. It wasn't a pleasant smell, but it was honest. The kind of place where a man could sit in a corner and be left alone if he carried himself a certain way. Wyatt Mercer carried himself that way. He'd arrived in town 2 days before the hunters did. Rode in on a gray gelding that was getting long in the tooth but still moved clean. Checked into the hotel on the far end of Main Street under his own name, which some people later said was either the bravest thing they'd ever heard of or the most reckless. He'd eaten dinner at the same table in the saloon both nights. Always the corner table, always with his back to the wall, always facing the door. He ordered the same thing each time, a plate of beans and salt pork, a glass of rye whiskey, and he paid before the food arrived. People noticed that last part. Paying early meant a man intended to leave quickly if he needed to, or that he'd learned the hard way not to owe anyone anything when trouble showed up unannounced. He was 41 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who'd worked outdoors their entire lives tended to look older. Leather skin, deep lines around the eyes, hair that had gone gray at the temples before he was 35. His hands were the hands of a rancher, not a gunfighter, wide across the palm, calloused at the base of every finger, with a scar along the right thumb that had come from a fence wire accident 13 years ago, and had never quite healed flat. He wore a revolver on his right hip the way a lot of men in Colorado Territory wore revolvers without ceremony and without announcement. It was just there, the same as his belt buckle or his boots. Nobody at the Dust Devil paid it much attention the first night. The second night, one of the bartenders mentioned to his wife that the quiet man in the corner table had never once touched the gun, never let his hand drift near it, never seemed to need the reassurance of knowing it was there, which either meant he was very calm or he was carrying it for someone else's benefit. Both things, as it turned out, were closer to the truth than the bartender realized. On the third morning, Wyatt woke before dawn, washed his face in the basin in his room, looked at himself in the small mirror above the dresser for a long moment, and said nothing. He dressed slowly. He strapped on the revolver, he put on his hat. Then he went down to the saloon, which didn't technically open until 10 in the morning, and knocked on the side door until the morning man let him in with an irritated grunt. He sat at the corner table. He asked for coffee. He waited. He'd been waiting there for nearly 3 hours when Dane Rourke pushed through the front doors. The thing about Dane Rourke that most people mentioned first was the speed. If you asked anyone who'd seen him work, which was not a comfortable conversation to have, because witnessing Dane Rourke work meant witnessing something that usually ended badly for at least one person present, they'd tell you about his hands. How they moved, how there was no transition, no middle step, between stillness and the gun being out. One moment it was holstered. The next it was in the air and already speaking. He was 33 years old, lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they're focused on something, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that never quite settled on any one thing. They moved constantly, those eyes. Cataloging. Measuring. He walked into a room the way a man walks into a room he's already decided he owns. And the 3 steps he took into the Dust Devil that morning carried all of that: the certainty, the mild contempt for anyone who might think otherwise, the absolute confidence of a man who had never, not once in his professional life, been on the wrong end of a draw. Behind him came Caleb Voss. Caleb was younger, 26, maybe 27, though his face had that pinched, ungenerous look of a man who'd been frightened for a long time and had mistaken it for toughness. He was nervous in this way that some men are nervous every moment of their lives, but have learned to cover it with aggression, the way you cover a bad smell with something worse. He wore 2 guns, which some men considered a professional statement, and other men considered overcompensating. His eyes went straight to Wyatt's table the second he walked through the door, and they stayed there. And then there was Gideon Shaw. Gideon was the one Wyatt had thought about the most during those 3 hours of waiting. The other two were known quantities dangerous. Yes, capable without question, but the kind of dangerous that operated according to pattern. Dane would be fast. Caleb would be scared, and therefore unpredictable in that particular narrow way that scared men are unpredictable. But Gideon Shaw was 58 years old and had been doing this work since before Dane Rourke had learned to walk. And men who lasted that long in this profession did not last by being fast or by being reckless. They lasted by being patient and by understanding things. Gideon walked in last, unhurried, and stood just inside the doorway for a moment without moving. His eyes went around the room the way water finds the low points in a floor systematically, without urgency, noting everything. He was heavy-set now, broader than he'd been 20 years ago, with a white beard trimmed close to the jaw and hands that were spotted with age but still entirely steady. He found Wyatt's table. He looked at Wyatt for 3 full seconds. Then he moved to the left side of the room while Dane moved to the right, and Caleb stayed near the center, and Wyatt understood that they'd done this particular arrangement before. The saloon had been half full when they walked in. By the time Gideon had reached his position on the left wall, it was a quarter full. People were leaving with the specific quiet efficiency of people who have learned to recognize the moment when being somewhere else becomes the most important decision of the day. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man named Hector who'd survived the war, and 2 subsequent bar fights that most men wouldn't have did not leave. He stood behind the bar with his arms at his sides and watched. Dane stopped about 15 feet from Wyatt's table. "Wyatt Mercer," he said, "not a question." Wyatt looked up from his coffee. He hadn't been looking at them as they came in, which was either strange or deliberate, and Dane couldn't quite decide which. "That's me," Wyatt said. "You know why we're here." "I have a general sense of it, yeah." Dane tilted his head slightly. Most men at this point in the conversation did something shifted in their seat, put their hands on the table, let their eyes go to the exits. Wyatt did none of those things. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at Dane with the kind of patient attention that a man gives a window salesman who's shown up at an inconvenient time. $5,000, Dane said. "Dead or alive, but Vane prefers dead. Saves paperwork. Silas always did hate paperwork," Wyatt said. He took a sip of the coffee, set the mug down carefully. "You boys ride together long?" The question threw Dane off just slightly, a half-second hesitation that Caleb noticed and Gideon noticed and Wyatt noticed, though none of them acknowledged it. "Long enough," Dane said. Wyatt looked at Caleb, then at Gideon, then back to Dane. "The young one's scared," he said. "I can tell because he keeps putting his thumb on his belt buckle. Men do that when they're trying not to reach for the gun too early. It's a way of keeping the hand busy," he paused. "The old man on my left, he's not scared at all, which is more concerning, honestly. The scared ones are predictable. The calm ones are harder to plan around." Caleb's face went tight. "The hell did you just—" "I'm not insulting you," Wyatt said without raising his voice. "I'm telling you what I see. It's not personal." "You got a lot of conversation in you for a man in your situation," Dane said. "My situation," Wyatt seemed to consider the phrase. 3 men walked into this saloon with a piece of paper saying I'm worth $5,000, and my situation is that I'm sitting at this table with a cup of coffee that's gone cold. He looked at the mug. Cold coffee is honestly the more pressing problem. Hector behind the bar later told his wife that he'd never seen a man face down 3 bounty hunters and complain about the temperature of his coffee. He said it like he was still trying to decide whether it was the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed or a symptom of something seriously wrong with the man's thinking. His wife said it sounded like both, and she was probably right. What Hector didn't know, what nobody in that saloon knew, was the weight of what Wyatt Mercer was carrying into that room. Not fear, though fear was there in small managed quantities. Not bravado, because bravado was a performance, and Wyatt had stopped performing for anyone about 15 years ago. What he was carrying was information. And information, held at the right time in the right way, was a different kind of weapon than the one on his hip. He'd known about the bounty for 11 days. The news had come through a ranch hand named Pettis, who'd ridden 3 days from Durango with a letter folded inside his hat. A letter from a lawyer named Hensley, who'd been doing quiet work on Wyatt's behalf for the better part of 2 years. Hensley had connections in the county recorder's office, and connections in the territorial marshal's office, and connections in several other places that Wyatt had spent considerable money cultivating over the years, because Wyatt Mercer had not built a 12,000-acre cattle operation in the Colorado Territory by being naive about the way the world worked. The letter said, "Vane has filed a bounty through a private channel in Pueblo. 5,000. 3 men contracted Rourke Voss Shaw. Rourke takes the lead. They'll come to you. Suggest you not be where they expect." Wyatt had read the letter twice, burned it in the ranch house fireplace, and then sat in the chair by the fire for a long time looking at the flames. He could have gone north. He had holdings up near Glenwood Springs, smaller, quieter, the kind of place where a man could disappear for a season, and nobody would think twice about it. He could have taken the letter to Marshal Briggs, though Briggs had a complicated relationship with Silas Vane that involved several favorable contracts, and Wyatt wasn't entirely confident in where that relationship would land if it was tested directly. He could have hired his own men, set up on the ranch, made it difficult. He'd thought about all of those things. He'd sat by that fire and thought about each option with the same methodical patience that had built the ranch in the first place, the same patience that had let him see bad deals coming 6 months before other men recognized them as bad, the same patience that had made him, over 20 years of stubborn, careful work, into exactly the kind of man that Silas Vane found threatening. And then he'd made a different decision. He would go to Blackwater Ridge. He would sit in the saloon and wait. He would let them find him, let them think they were finding him, and he would do it in a town full of witnesses, on his own terms, in a corner with his back to the wall. Because what Wyatt understood that Vane didn't was that Vane had made a mistake. Not in hiring the men Rourke and Shaw were genuinely capable, and even the nervous young Voss could be dangerous under the right circumstances. The mistake was in what Vane thought this was. Vane thought it was an elimination, a problem-solving exercise. Send 3 professionals, collect a body, move on. What it actually was, if Wyatt could manage the next several hours with some competence, was evidence. Evidence of conspiracy. Evidence of intent. Evidence of the kind of thing that territorial judges and newspaper editors and cattlemen's associations found extremely interesting when it was laid out in front of them with proper documentation. The letter was burned. But other things weren't. Wyatt's lawyer had spent 2 years very quietly accumulating records, payment ledgers, forged land assessments, a deposition from a survey team that had been told to misrepresent boundary lines and had done so, and whose lead surveyor had since moved to Kansas City but retained a guilty conscience and an excellent memory. The names of 4 men who had come into conflict with Silas Vane's expansion plans and subsequently disappeared, not bounty hunted, not arrested, just disappeared, the way a rock disappears into deep water. All of that was sitting in an iron strongbox in the back room of a mercantile in Blackwater Ridge, deposited there 3 weeks ago by a man who looked like a traveling salesman and was in fact a junior associate in Hensley's law practice. Wyatt just needed to survive long enough to open it. "Let me ask you something," Wyatt said to Dane. The saloon was almost empty now. Just Hector behind the bar, an old man in the back who seemed to have fallen asleep and either not noticed or not cared what was happening, and the 4 of them, 3 hunters and 1 man who was not quite their prey. Dane didn't respond, but he didn't move either, which Wyatt took as permission to continue. "How long you been doing this kind of work?" "Long enough to not be interested in conversation." 10 years? More? Dane's jaw tightened. 12. 12, Wyatt nodded. 12 years of what? 40, 50 contracts? More? Enough. And in 12 years, how many times has someone put a bounty on a man and been completely honest about why? That landed differently than Dane expected. Wyatt could see at a flicker of something crossing the man's face that wasn't irritation or contempt, but something closer to actual consideration. It was there for less than a second, and then Dane's expression went flat again. "Don't matter why," Dane said. "Sure it does," Wyatt said. "Not to the job, maybe, but to what happens after." He leaned forward slightly in his chair, both hands still wrapped around the cold coffee mug. "Silas Vane told you I'm a wanted man. What exactly am I wanted for?" Silence. "There's a bounty document," Dane said finally. "Signed by who? Who signed it?" "Vane can't sign his own bounty papers. There has to be a county official." "Who signed it?" Another hesitation. Shorter this time, but there. "Deputy Recorder in Pueblo County," Caleb said from across the room, and then seemed to wish he hadn't said anything when Dane looked at him. "Millard Pitch," Wyatt said. "Short man wears a green vest. Drinks more than he should." Caleb blinked. "How did you?" "Because Millard Pitch has been signing documents for Silas Vane for 6 years, and I have copies of 37 of them in a box 4 blocks from this saloon." Wyatt said it, the same way he'd said everything else conversationally, without urgency, like a man explaining the weather. "Millard Pitch is going to have a very educational few months once certain parties in the territorial capital start asking questions." Gideon Shaw, who had not said a single word since entering the saloon, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly against the left wall. Dane's eyes hardened. "You trying to talk your way out of this?" "I'm trying to give you information that's useful to you," Wyatt said. "What you do with it is your business," he paused. "But you should know that 3 men riding into a town and attempting to collect a bounty that turns out to be fraudulently issued that creates legal exposure. For the men who collected it, not just for the man who ordered it." "You're not going to talk us out of this," Dane said. His voice had gone flat in a way that meant the conversational portion of the morning was coming to an end. "I know," Wyatt said. "Then what are you doing?" Wyatt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the whiskey glass on the table, still full, still untouched, sitting exactly where he'd placed it when the bartender brought it over an hour ago. "Stalling," he said, "a little." That answer confused Dane more than anything else Wyatt had said, and confusion was not an emotion Dane Rourke was comfortable with. He functioned on clarity. On the known order of things, the target, the approach, the draw, the outcome. Conversations that didn't follow recognizable patterns made the engine of his thinking stumble, and when Dane Rourke's thinking stumbled, he defaulted to what he knew best. "Enough," Dane said. He rolled his shoulders, let his right hand drop to his side. Caleb took 3 steps toward the table from his position in the middle of the room. Gideon, on the left wall, straightened off the wall and moved 1 boot forward, settling his weight. The formation clicked into place with the efficiency of rehearsal. Caleb coming in from the center to crowd the target, force a decision. Dane on the right drawing fire and attention. Gideon on the left, patient and final, closing the only remaining angle. Wyatt had spent considerable time thinking about that formation. He had thought about it in the hotel room the night before, lying on the narrow bed and staring at the ceiling while the sounds of the street filtered through the thin walls. He'd thought about the geometry of it, the angles, the timing. 3 men, each knowing his role, each expecting a target who would behave in one of 3 ways: draw immediately, run, or freeze. They'd trained for all 3. They'd rehearsed for all 3, probably without fully realizing that rehearsal was what they'd been doing. Because that's what a decade of professional pattern becomes, not a choice but an instinct, grooved so deep into the muscle and the reflex that it stops being a decision and starts being simply what happens. That was the weakness, not speed, not accuracy, not nerve. The weakness was in the certainty, the confidence that they knew exactly what was coming, that they'd seen every version of this moment, that nothing a man sitting at a corner table in a Colorado saloon could do would fall outside the range of their experience. Wyatt hoped they were wrong about that. He looked at the whiskey glass. He looked at Dane's right hand, loose and ready at his side. He looked at Caleb, 3 steps closer now, whose thumb had left the belt buckle and was hovering just above the grip of his left pistol. He looked at Gideon, who was watching him with the calm, assessing eyes of a man who had spent 30 years watching other men make decisions, cataloging them, learning from them, and who had survived on that learning long past the point where most men in his profession had stopped surviving anything. 3 men, 1 formation. An entire career's worth of preparation. And Wyatt Mercer, sitting at the corner table with both hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, had spent 3 hours that morning thinking about all of it: the formation, the men, the timing, the geometry, and had arrived at a conclusion that was both very simple and somewhat alarming. He was probably going to get shot. He'd built that into the calculation, the way a rancher builds a bad year into his financial expectations. It was not a desirable outcome, but it was a probable one. And a man who refused to account for probable outcomes in his planning was not a man who built 12,000 acres out of raw territory. He'd accepted it the shoulder, most likely, or the side, somewhere survivable if he was lucky and the doctor got there quickly. What he couldn't accept was the alternative. He reached forward on the table and picked up the whiskey glass. Dane's hand moved, and Wyatt threw the glass directly into Dane Rourke's face. The whiskey glass caught Dane Rourke square across the bridge of the nose. It didn't shatter, it was a thick-bottomed saloon glass, the kind built to survive exactly the sort of rough handling that saloons produced, but it hit hard enough to snap Dane's head back, hard enough to send whiskey spraying across his face and into his eyes, hard enough to do the one thing that Wyatt had calculated it would do: break the formation. Not for long, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. But 2 seconds in the geometry of a gunfight is not a small thing. Dane's hand had already been moving when the glass left Wyatt's fingers, and the reflex carried it forward even as his head snapped back. The draw was already happening. Muscle pulling the revolver up out of the holster on pure trained instinct. But the whiskey in his eyes changed everything. The hand came up. The gun came with it. The aim was gone. Wyatt was already out of the chair. He didn't go for his gun first. He went sideways, hard and fast, pushing the table as he moved, not flipping it dramatically, just shoving it into the space between himself and Caleb Voss, buying distance and a half-second of disruption. The coffee mug slid off and hit the floor and broke. The table legs scraped across the planking with a sound like something tearing. Caleb had both pistols out. But Caleb was 26 years old and scared, and had been scared since the moment he'd walked through the door, and the table coming at him knocked the careful choreography out of his hands. He stepped back. Both guns were up, but neither of them fired, because Caleb Voss had a problem that he'd never quite solved in 6 years of this work. When the moment came faster than he expected, his trigger fingers wanted confirmation before they moved, and confirmation took time he didn't always have. Wyatt's gun cleared the holster. He shot Caleb Voss in the right shoulder. Not center mass, not because Wyatt was feeling generous, but because the angle was wrong, and the shot he had was the shot he had, and there was no time to want a better one. The bullet caught Caleb high and spun him hard to the right, and both of Caleb's pistols fired on the way down, one into the floor, one into the far wall about 4 feet above Hector's head behind the bar, and Hector dropped flat with a speed that suggested this was not his first experience with misdirected gunfire. Caleb hit the floor and stayed there, not dead but done. The gun in his left hand skittered across the planking and stopped against a chair leg. 1 second, maybe less. Wyatt turned toward Gideon. And Gideon Shaw, who had been doing this work since before Wyatt Mercer was old enough to shave, was already there. The old man had not panicked when the glass flew. He had not flinched when Caleb went down. He had done what 30 years of this work had taught him to do. He had waited for the target to commit, waited for the line to clear, and when Wyatt turned, Gideon already had the shot. The gun went off. The impact hit Wyatt in the left shoulder, like a fence post, swung full force, a sudden, catastrophic wrongness that knocked him sideways into a support pillar and took everything from the waist up and turned it into noise. He hit the pillar with his right side, grabbed it with his right hand on pure reflex, and held on. The pain arrived about a half second after the impact, which was the body's way of being kind before it was honest. It was not a small pain. Wyatt's vision went gray at the edges for a moment, not dark, just gray, like a photograph left us in the sun too long. He was aware of his right hand still holding the revolver. He was aware that Gideon was already adjusting his aim for a second shot. He was aware, in a distant and somewhat academic way, that he was bleeding, because the warmth spreading down his left arm was unmistakable and not good. He shot Gideon Shaw before the second shot came. He couldn't tell you later with any precision how he managed the aim. The shoulder was wrong. The grip was wrong. The world had gone slightly sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the physical position of the room. But the gun was up, and the target was there, and somewhere underneath all the noise and the gray edges, the part of Wyatt Mercer that had grown up on the frontier and learned to shoot before he learned to read, had already done the math. The bullet caught Gideon in the upper chest, left of center. The old man's second shot went into the ceiling. Gideon sat down against the wall, not fell sat, like a man who'd decided abruptly to rest. His gun hand came down to his side, and the revolver stayed in it because his fingers didn't know to let go. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at him. There was something in the old man's expression that wasn't quite surprise. It was more like the expression of a man revising an earlier conclusion. Dane Rourke was still standing. His eyes had cleared. The whiskey had burned, and his vision was blurred at the edges, but he could see. The gun was in his hand. He was pointing it at Wyatt, who was leaning against the support pillar with his left arm hanging wrong in his right hand, holding a revolver that had 1, maybe 2 shots left in it, and blood coming down the back of his coat in a way that was going to ruin the coat completely. They looked at each other across 15 feet of saloon floor. "Drop it," Dane said. His voice was tight. Not scared. Dane Rourke did not scare easily, but tight in the way of a man who has had his careful plan broken open, and is working very hard not to show how much that bothers him. Wyatt didn't drop it. He also didn't raise it. His arm didn't have the architecture for that at the moment. He was keeping the gun low and pointing roughly in Dane's direction, which was less a tactical position than an honest one. "Your partner's alive," Wyatt said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Just shot. I can see that." Old man on the wall. Wyatt's breath came short. He paused, waited for it. "Don't know. He might make it." "Depends on the doctor. You're bleeding," Dane said. It wasn't concern. It was an observation. The way a hunter notes which direction the wounded animal is moving. "I'm aware. You can't lift that gun." Wyatt looked down at the revolver in his hand. "Probably not above my hip," he agreed. Dane's aim tightened. "Then we're done here." "We're not done," Wyatt said. "And you know it." Something moved across Dane's face. Not uncertainty exactly, more the shadow of it, the shape of a question he hadn't expected to be asking himself in this particular moment. "I got 2 men down," Dane said. "I got a clear shot at you. I got a signed document in my saddlebag saying you're worth $5,000. Walk me through what part of this isn't done." "The part where you collect it," Wyatt said. Silence. Outside, Blackwater Ridge was making the sounds of a town that has heard gunfire and is deciding what to do about it. Boots on the boardwalk. Voices, the creak of a door opening somewhere. The world outside the saloon continuing to exist, indifferent and busy. "Millard Pitch signed your bounty papers," Wyatt said. "I told you that already. What I didn't tell you is that Millard Pitch has been signing documents for Silas Vane for 6 years, and about 14 months ago he signed something that is going to end both their careers and possibly their freedom." Dane's expression didn't change, but he didn't shoot. There's a land parcel, Wyatt said. He shifted his weight slightly against the pillar, found a position that hurt less, stayed with it. Southeast corner of my property, along the Arroyo Creek drainage. Vane has been trying to claim it for 3 years. The creek feeds about 40,000 acres of grazing land, and whoever controls the creek controls about a third of the viable cattle range in this part of the territory. He paused to breathe. Millard Pitch signed a land assessment document 14 months ago that moved the recorded boundary of my property 80 yards to the west. Just 80 yards. Sounds like nothing. In reality, that 80 yards puts the creek entirely on land that Vane has a prior claim to. This is not my problem, Dane said. The surveyors who produced that assessment, Wyatt continued, as if Dane hadn't spoken, were paid by Vane. 2 of them are still in the territory. One of them is in Kansas City, and he has a conscience that's been bothering him for 14 months and a very detailed memory. He looked at Dane steadily. There are also 4 men who came into conflict with Vane's expansion and disappeared. I have names, I have dates. I have 1 witness who can place Vane's money at the scene of one of those disappearances. You're stalling again. Yes, Wyatt said, but what I'm telling you is true. Dane was quiet for a moment. His gun was still up. His aim was still good. Wyatt could see the discipline in it, the practiced steadiness of a man who'd held a gun on people for 12 years, and had learned that the arm got tired if you let it think about what it was doing. Say I believe you, Dane said. Say every word you just told me is accurate. What does that change about this morning? Depends on which direction you want to walk out of it. Dane made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You're sitting here bleeding onto the floor of a saloon with a gun you can't lift, and you're making me an offer. I'm telling you what exists, Wyatt said. There's a strongbox in the back of Hollis Mercantile, 4 blocks from here. Everything I just described is in it: the documents, the depositions, the names, the dates. A letter from a lawyer in Durango who has been building this case for 2 years. That box is set to be opened by the Territorial Marshal's office in 12 days, whether I'm alive or not. I arranged that before I came here. He paused. So you can collect whatever Vane owes you. And in 12 days, when that box opens and people start asking questions, the bounty you collected is going to be the first thing the investigation looks at. Who paid it? Who carried it? Who signed the original paperwork? Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, there was no sudden revelation, no moment of obvious change. But Dane's gun arm dropped about 2 inches. The tightness around his eyes changed character, from the tightness of imminent action to the tightness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't expect to be doing. You came here on purpose, Dane said. It wasn't entirely a question. Yes, to a public saloon, with witnesses. Hector over there has an excellent memory, Wyatt said. I verified that before I sat down. Dane looked at Hector, who had come back up from behind the bar and was standing there with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing faces do when they are very carefully not expressing anything. And the old man on the wall, Dane said, and Caleb. I didn't plan for them to get shot, Wyatt said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that wasn't quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. I planned for a conversation. The shooting was he stopped. It was what it was. Dane lowered the gun the rest of the way. He didn't holster it. He just let it hang at his side and stood there in the middle of the saloon with 2 of his partners down, and a plan that had been very clean 12 hours ago now sitting in pieces around him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man recalibrating everything. You're saying Vane's going to fall, Dane said. I'm saying the case exists and it's going to be heard, Wyatt said. Whether Vane falls depends on the judge and the evidence, and about 15 other things I can't control. But I've been building this for 2 years, and I didn't come to Blackwater Ridge to lose it. If Vane falls, your contract's with a man who won't be able to pay it, Wyatt said, or won't be in a position to once the territorial authorities start looking at his accounts. Dane stood with that for a long moment. Outside, the boots on the boardwalk had gotten louder. Someone was going to come through that door. Eventually, the town sheriff, a deputy, a group of concerned citizens armed with curiosity and a couple of rifles. The clock on that was ticking. What do you want from me? Dane said finally. His voice had shifted. Not friendly Dane Rourke was not built for friendly, not in this context, not in this morning, but the aggression had gone out of it, replaced by something more practical. Nothing, Wyatt said. I don't want anything from you. I want you to know what you rode into before someone else explains it to you in worse circumstances. He pushed off the support pillar slightly, tested his legs. They held. The left arm was bad. He wasn't going to be using it for anything useful today, but the legs were steady, and that was what he needed. Get your men to a doctor. Both of them can make it if they move fast. Dane looked at Caleb on the floor. The younger man was conscious, breathing in sharp, shallow pulls, his right hand pressed against the shoulder wound. He was pale and shaking, but his eyes were open and tracking. Gideon Shaw, against the left wall, had his eyes closed. His chest was moving. The blood on his shirt was dark and spreading. but slow, not the fast arterial kind, which was something. You shot 2 of my men, Dane said. You came here to kill me, Wyatt said. Another silence. This one had a different quality, less like standoff, and more like 2 men, processing the same set of facts from different angles and arriving at the same reluctant conclusion, which was that the morning had gone in a direction that nobody was entirely satisfied with. Dane holstered his gun. He walked to Caleb, crouched down, got his hands under the younger man's good arm. Can you stand? Think so, Caleb managed. His voice was thin. Yeah, think so. Then stand. Dane got Caleb upright with the careful efficiency of a man who'd handled injured people before, in other contexts, and walked him toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at Wyatt. The strongbox, he said. 12 days. 12 days, Wyatt confirmed. Dane looked at him for a moment, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular evaluating attention of a man who is deciding whether to file something under problem or under information. Then he looked at Gideon, still against the wall. I'll send the doctor, he said. He walked Caleb out the door. The saloon was quiet. Wyatt stood against the support pillar and listened to the sound of his own breathing, which was doing things he didn't fully trust, and the sound of the blood moving down the inside of his coat sleeve, which was doing things that were even less encouraging. The pain in his shoulder had moved past the initial catastrophic announcement and settled into something long and grinding and deeply unpleasant, the kind of pain that doesn't peak so much as install itself and inform you it's planning to stay for a while. He looked at Gideon Shaw. The old man's eyes opened. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. The morning light through the saloon windows fell across the floor between them in long pale bars, and dust moved through it, just the ordinary indoor dust of a saloon, stirred up by boots and table legs and a morning's worth of violence, settling back down now because the violence was done, and the air didn't know it was supposed to stay disturbed. You planned that, Gideon said. His voice was rough and thin, each word costing something. The glass. Not specifically, Wyatt said. I planned something unexpected. The glass was what was on the table. Gideon's mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the shape a smile would take if it were being assembled from components that didn't usually work together. Training, he said. You said training. That's what I said. You were right. He stopped. The breathing was labored. Each inhale a project. Dane's going to think about what you told him. I know. He's not going to report back to Vane. Wyatt looked at the old man carefully. What makes you say that? Gideon was quiet for a moment. The effort of speaking seemed to require intervals of simple existing between the words. Dane's not stupid, he said finally. And Dane doesn't like being the last one to know something. You just made him the last one to know a lot of things. He rested. He'll disappear, cash out whatever he can and disappear. That's what he does when the ground shifts. And Caleb? Caleb does whatever Dane does, a pause always has. Wyatt nodded slowly. He was still standing, which struck him as something of an achievement, given the circumstances. But standing was getting harder by degrees, and the wall was starting to look extremely inviting. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Gideon considered the question with the unhurried patience of a man who has reasons, and is deciding whether any of them are worth the breath required to explain them. I'm 60 years old come April, he said. I have been doing work I'm not proud of for 30 years. I have a daughter in Santa Fe who doesn't know what I do, and I have been grateful for that ignorance every day since she was born. He looked up at the ceiling. Silas Vane paid me $400 to come here. $400, something in his face shifted. I'm worth more than $400. As a man, I mean, or I should have been. Wyatt said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that which wouldn't sound either patronizing or dishonest. The box in the mercantile, Gideon said. 12 days. 12 days. You should get a doctor working on it, Wyatt said. The front door of the saloon opened and 2 men came in, one of them the town sheriff, a capable-looking man named Aldous Crane who'd held the job for 9 years and had seen most of what a frontier town produced in the way of disorder, and the other was a shorter man, carrying a black bag who Wyatt recognized as the doctor. Behind them, visible through the doorway, were several members of the Blackwater Ridge public who had gathered on the boardwalk with the particular combination of concern and avid curiosity that a town produces in the aftermath of gunfire. Sheriff Crane looked at the scene. He looked at Gideon against the wall. He looked at Wyatt against the pillar. He looked at Hector behind the bar. Hector, he said. Morning, Sheriff. How many shots fired? Hector held up 4 fingers, then thought about it and added a thumb. 5, Crane said, give or take. Crane looked at Wyatt. You Mercer? Yes, you're bleeding. Sheriff, I appreciate the update, Wyatt said. Crane almost smiled, not quite, but close. He stepped back and let the doctor through to Gideon, and then he stood in the middle of the saloon with his thumbs in his belt and looked around at the wreckage of the morning, the broken coffee mug, the skid marks where the table had been shoved, the 2 spent shells on the floor, the dark stain spreading from beneath where Caleb had been lying. And he did what good sheriffs do in the aftermath of complicated situations. He started, slowly and methodically, putting the sequence back together in his head. Bounty hunters, he said to Wyatt, 3 of them. One of the men who walked out, he said the same. Dane Rourke, Wyatt said. The one still here is Gideon Shaw. The younger one is Caleb Voss. Crane wrote the names down in a small notebook he'd produced from his vest pocket. And the bounty, issued out of Pueblo County, signed by the deputy recorder. Man named Millard Pitch. Wyatt pushed off the pillar and found with some surprise that his legs were still operational. He walked toward the nearest chair and sat down in it, with less grace than he would have preferred. The bounty is fraudulent. I can document that. Can document a great deal more than that. Crane watched him. You came here on purpose, he said. To this town, to this saloon. It was the same observation Dane had made, and Wyatt gave it the same answer. Yes. That was either very smart or very stupid. Probably some of both, Wyatt said. My lawyer would say the former. My shoulder is currently arguing for the latter. Crane looked at him for a long moment. He was the kind of man Wyatt had sensed it even before this morning, in the 2 days he'd spent watching Blackwater Ridge arrange itself around him, who made decisions carefully and stuck to them, who carried the law as a genuine thing and not just a title. He'd heard of Aldous Crane in a roundabout way, through a Cattlemen's Association meeting 3 years back where Crane's name had come up in the context of a land dispute that he'd handled correctly when several other sheriffs in similar positions had handled it otherwise. Wyatt had filed that information away the same way he filed everything quietly, without ceremony, against potential future use. He was using it now. There's a strong box at Hollis Mercantile, Wyatt said, left there 3 weeks ago by an associate of my lawyer. I'd like you to be present when it's opened. Crane raised an eyebrow. Present how? As a witness. As the law in this town, which is what's going to matter when the contents become relevant. Wyatt looked at him steadily. What's in that box is going to create significant disruption for a significant number of people. I'd like a man with a badge standing next to me when it happens. Crane considered this. What's in it? Evidence that Silas Vane has been systematically defrauding landowners across this part of the territory for at least 6 years. Forged land assessments, fraudulent boundary claims, documentation of payments made to county officials, names and dates connected to 4 men who disappeared after conflicting with Vane's expansion. The room had gone very quiet. Not just the saloon, the entire room, including Hector behind the bar and the doctor working on Gideon's chest wound, and the sounds filtering in from the boardwalk outside. All of it seemed to hold for a moment. Crane wrote something else in the notebook. Then he looked up. When? I'd prefer today, Wyatt said, but I need a doctor first. The doctor's name was Fenn, and he was good at his work in the competent, unglamorous way of men who've learned their trade in difficult conditions rather than favorable ones. He'd trained under an army field surgeon during the war, which meant he'd seen wounds that made Wyatt's shoulder look like a minor inconvenience, and his hands were steady and his manner was businesslike, in a way that Wyatt found deeply preferable to any alternative. He told Wyatt the bullet had gone through clean in the back of the shoulder, out the front, missing the bone and the major vessels by what Fenn described as more than I expected, less than you deserved. He told him the bleeding would slow with pressure, the pain would become manageable in somewhere between 2 days and never, depending on factors he couldn't control. He told him the arm needed to be immobilized for at least 3 weeks, and that Wyatt was going to ignore that advice. And Wyatt didn't argue the point, because Fenn was probably right on both counts. The doctor then went to work on Gideon Shaw, and the news there was less clean. The bullet had not gone through. It was lodged somewhere in the chest cavity in a position that Fenn described with careful vagueness as not immediately fatal, but requiring attention that this town cannot provide. He'd need to be moved carefully, with a proper wagon, to a surgeon in Pueblo or Denver, who had the equipment and the training for that kind of extraction. Gideon listened to this assessment, with his eyes open and his expression the same calm that had been there when he'd walked into the saloon that morning, though now it carried something underneath it that hadn't been there before, not fear exactly, but the particular gravity of a man who has been told, by a reliable source, that his situation is serious, and who is deciding what to do with that information. Pueblo's 2 days, he said to Fenn. If the wagon's good and the road's dry, Fenn said. Gideon looked at Wyatt, who had moved to a chair closer to the wall where Gideon was sitting, because moving across the saloon had seemed like the right thing to do, and the distance had cost him more than he'd budgeted for in the current state of his shoulder. Santa Fe's 3 days south, Gideon said. Wyatt understood what he was saying. I'll see that you get there, he said. Gideon looked at him. I mean it, Wyatt said. Wagon, driver, whatever Fenn says you need. He paused. You told me useful things this morning. And whatever else this morning was, it doesn't need to be the last thing your daughter hears about you. Something moved across Gideon Shaw's face that was too complicated to name, and too private to examine closely. He looked away, at the far wall of the saloon, at nothing in particular. His chest rose and fell with the careful, deliberate rhythm of a man managing pain. "The bounty," he said after a moment. "I'm not going to pursue it," Wyatt said. "Not against you. Not against Caleb either," assuming his shoulder heels. He looked at Crane, who had come closer during the doctor's work and was standing a respectful distance away. "Sheriff," Crane nodded slowly. "Self-defense is pretty clear," he said. "The whole town heard 3 guns go off before I walked in the door." He glanced at Hector. 4, Hector said. 4, Crane amended. Mercer's was the last. It wasn't legally airtight, not by the precise standards of a courtroom. But Blackwater Ridge was a frontier town, and its sheriff was a pragmatic man. And the men who'd walked into the Dust Devil that morning had walked in with a document and a purpose that was now, in the light of everything Wyatt had said, considerably more complicated than it had looked from the outside. The strong box was open that afternoon. Wyatt sat at a table in the back room of Hollis Mercantile, with his left arm in a sling that Fenn had constructed from a shirt donated by the bartender Hector, and Sheriff Crane sat across from him, and the mercantile owner Hollis, a thin, nervous man who'd been holding the box in his back room for 3 weeks, and had spent most of that time trying not to think about what might be in it, stood against the far wall with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who wants to be somewhere else. Wyatt turned the key. The lock opened. He lifted the lid. The contents were exactly what Hensley had promised. The documents were organized with the careful legibility of a man who expected them to be read by people who were not already sympathetic. Clear headings, dates, names, amounts. The land assessment with Millard Pitch's signature. The survey maps with the 80-yard discrepancy annotated in red ink. 3 sworn depositions notarized from individuals who had direct knowledge of Vane's fraudulent boundary manipulations. The payment records, actual payment records, not reconstructed estimates showing money moving from accounts connected to Silas Vane to county officials, survey crews, and on 4 separate occasions, to men who were listed in another section of the box as individuals who had subsequently disappeared. Crane read in silence. He read for a long time. The afternoon light came through the single small window in the back room and moved across the table as the hour shifted, and Wyatt sat with his shoulder burning and his left arm useless and watched Crane's face as the man worked through document after document. And what he saw there was not surprise, not entirely, but the specific expression of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is now being given the precision and the weight to confirm it. "How long did this take?" Crane asked, not looking up. 2 years of active accumulation, Wyatt said. "Longer if you count from when I first started understanding what Vane was doing. And you came here." Crane did look up then. "You came to this town specifically." "Vane has connections in Pueblo," Wyatt said. "I wasn't confident about the marshal there. I knows less about Blackwater Ridge. But what I know is that you've been here 9 years, and in those 9 years there's been no indication that Vane's money has reached you." Crane was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to say." "It's what brought me here," Wyatt said. "A man building a case needs to know where the ground is solid." Another silence. Crane looked back down at the documents. He turned another page. He found the section with the 4 names of the disappeared men and read it slowly. And his jaw set in a way that told Wyatt the names were not entirely new to him, that at least one of them connected to something Crane had already known or suspected. "Briggs in Pueblo," Crane said. "You mentioned him." "I said I wasn't confident," Wyatt said carefully. "I don't have documentation connecting him directly. What I have is a pattern of inaction around Vane's operations that is either incompetence or something else. I can't prove which, but you're telling me. I'm telling you because you need to know it when you take this to the territorial level," Wyatt said. "The territorial marshal's office is where this needs to go, above Briggs. And it needs to go with a badge behind it, from a jurisdiction where Vane's money hasn't already done its work." Crane closed the top document and looked at the stack. The stack was substantial. The stack represented 2 years of a lawyer's careful work, and the guilty consciences of 4 men who'd been paid to do wrong things and hadn't entirely managed to live with it. "I'll need to telegraph the territorial office now," Crane said. "Yes, this is going to take time to process. Weeks, maybe longer." "I know, and Vane will know it's coming before it arrives," Crane said. "Men like Vane always know. He has enough people in enough places to feel the ground shift." "I know that too," Wyatt said. "That's why I needed the public setting. The saloon this morning, the witnesses, the 3 bounty hunters who all know what's in this box now, that's insurance. If Vane were to take action against me again, it would confirm everything in these documents, and then some." Crane looked at him steadily. "You put yourself in a saloon with 3 killers as an insurance policy. It was a calculated risk," Wyatt said. "Was it supposed to hurt this much?" Wyatt looked at his shoulder, at the sling, at the dark stain showing through Hector's donated shirt. "No," he said. "That part was less calculated. Crane made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been given more room to develop. He gathered the documents back into the box and closed the lid and put both hands flat on top of it and sat there for a moment, and the weight of what was in the box seemed to exist in the room as something almost physical. "Mercer," he said. "Sheriff, why didn't you just take this to the territorial office yourself? Ride to Denver, hand it over, let them deal with it." It was a fair question. Wyatt had thought about it seriously, had spent evenings on the ranch examining it from every angle and checking his own reasoning for the particular kind of wishful distortion that careful men are still capable of. "Because Vane has more reach than I can outride," he said. "If I go to Denver with a box of documents, I'm one man with a story. Vane is a man with money and connections and the ability to introduce sufficient doubt to delay a process until he can find a way to close it." He looked at Crane. But 3 bounty hunters who came to collect a fraudulent bounty and ended up in a public saloon with witnesses and a sheriff who has now read the documents, that's something harder to delay. That's something that moves because momentum is already behind it. Crane sat with that. "You turned yourself into evidence," he said. "I turned the whole morning into evidence," Wyatt said, "including the part where I got shot." Outside, Blackwater Ridge was doing what towns do in the long afternoon of a difficult day: processing, talking, the community digesting what had happened in the Dust Devil that morning, and beginning the slow work of deciding what it meant. Wyatt could hear it through the thin wall of the mercantile's backroom voices, boots, the particular animated quality of a small town's collective conversation when it has something genuine to chew on. He thought about Gideon Shaw, who was being loaded into a wagon with blankets and a bottle of laudanum for the journey south. He thought about Caleb Voss, who was in the doctor's office with a shoulder wound and a shaken expression, and presumably some serious reconsideration underway about his professional future. He thought about Dane Rourke, who was already gone out of town before noon, exactly as Gideon had predicted, taking his calculating eyes and his 12 years of fast hands and riding them in whatever direction felt most like not here. He thought about Silas Vane, sitting in whatever comfortable room a man like Vane occupied, waiting for a report that was not going to arrive the way he expected. And he thought about the ranch, 12,000 acres of land along the creek drainage, the cattle coming in off summer grass, the fence line on the southeast corner that needed 2 new posts that he'd been meaning to put in for 3 weeks. The ordinary work of a thing he'd built, waiting for him to come back to it. "Sheriff," he said. Crane looked up. "I'd like to stay in Blackwater Ridge for a few days. Until the telegraph goes out, and you have confirmation the territorial office has received it." He paused. "After that, I need to go home." Crane nodded. "That's reasonable. The doctor says I should rest the shoulder for 3 weeks." "What are you going to do?" Wyatt looked at the iron box on the table between them, at what it represented: 2 years of patience, of building something that couldn't be punched down or scared away, of choosing the kind of fight that wore different clothes than the one most men expected. "Put in those fence posts," he said, "then rest." The telegraph went out that same evening. Crane wrote it himself, standing at the operator's desk in the small office next to the post building, with Wyatt sitting in the chair by the window, because standing for extended periods had become a negotiation with his shoulder that he was consistently losing. The operator, a young man named Pryor, who had the carefully neutral expression of someone whose job required him to transmit other people's significant information without reacting to it, tapped the message out in 3 separate transmissions, one to the territorial marshal's office in Denver, one to the county court recorder's office, and one to a judge named Harlan Fitch in Colorado Springs, who Crane knew personally and trusted in the particular careful way that frontier lawmen trusted anyone, which was to say partially and conditionally, but more than most. Wyatt listened to the tapping and said nothing. When it was done, Pryor handed Crane the confirmation slips, and Crane handed them to Wyatt, and Wyatt looked at them for a moment before folding them into his coat pocket. They were small pieces of paper. They didn't look like the kind of thing that could end a man's empire, but then again, most things that ended empires didn't look like much from close up. "How long before you hear back?" Wyatt asked. "Denver's fast," Crane said. "Day, maybe 2. Fitch is slower, he likes to think before he responds, which is either a virtue or a professional habit. I've never decided which." "You trust him?" "I trust his record," Crane said, "which is the most honest answer I can give you." He looked at Wyatt. "You should get some sleep," Fenn said. "Rest." Fenn also said 3 weeks on the arm, Wyatt said. "I've been ignoring that since noon." Crane almost smiled again. He seemed to do that almost smile, stopped just short of it, as if the smile were a door he kept meaning to open and then reconsidered. Wyatt walked back to the hotel. The night air in Blackwater Ridge was the particular cool of late-season mountain evenings, carrying the smell of pine and creek water and dust that hadn't been wet in several weeks. The Main Street boardwalk was quiet, a few lights in windows, the sound of the saloon from the far end. the creak of a sign somewhere. Ordinary night sounds for an ordinary frontier town, except that the town had spent the day processing something that wasn't ordinary, and that processing had the quality of something that had entered the community's bloodstream and was going to move through it for a while before settling. People had looked at him today. Not the way people look at a stranger. He'd been past that particular kind of look after his first day in Blackwater Ridge. This was different. The woman at the counter of the dry goods store who'd caught his eye through the window and then looked away quickly. The two men outside the barber shop who'd stopped talking when he walked past and didn't start again until he'd gone another 20 yards. The boy, maybe 12, 13, who'd followed him at a distance from the mercantile to the hotel and then stood on the far side of the street and watched him go in, with the wide-eyed focused attention of someone witnessing something he didn't have categories for yet. Wyatt didn't know what those looks meant exactly. He was too tired and in too much pain to analyze them carefully, and he was aware that tired and hurting men tended to read things into faces that weren't necessarily there. He'd go with Hector's assessment instead. When Wyatt had left the saloon that afternoon, the bartender had put a glass of whiskey on the bar and said, without preamble, "On the house." When Wyatt had pointed out he hadn't ordered anything, Hector had said, "No, and you didn't run either." So it wasn't a speech. But Wyatt thought it was probably the most accurate summary of the day that he was going to get. He slept badly, which was not a surprise. The shoulder-made sleep, a project requiring constant renegotiation of position. And every time he found something that worked, his body would relax into it, and then tighten again when the wound reminded him of its presence. And this cycle repeated itself through most of the night, with the relentless patience of a creditor who knows you can't leave the building. Around 3 a.m, he gave up on horizontal, moved to the chair by the window, and sat there with his arm in the sling and watched the empty street below, and thought about things he'd rather not have been thinking about. He thought about Gideon Shaw on the wagon south, whether the old man would make it to Santa Fe, whether his daughter would be there when he arrived, or whether Gideon would have to send word ahead, and what that word would say. "I've been shot, come see me. I may have some explaining to do about my career." He thought about the look on Gideon's face when he'd said, "I'm worth more than $400. As a man, I mean. The rawness of it. The specific grief of a man arriving at 60 years old at a reckoning he should have had 30 years ago and hadn't. He thought about Silas Vane. He'd met Vane twice. Once at a Cattlemen's Association dinner 4 years ago, where they'd been introduced briefly and shaken hands and exchanged the 3 or 4 sentences that constitute sufficient social interaction between men who are politely aware they don't like each other. Vane was a large man, not tall but substantial, with the kind of physical presence that came from decades of sitting across negotiating tables from people and winning. He had very small, very attentive eyes and a way of listening to people that felt less like interest and more like calculation. The way a man listens not for what you're saying, but for the space between what you're saying and what you're not. The second time was 2 years ago, at a land commission hearing in Pueblo, where Vane had been presenting a case for a boundary adjustment that Wyatt had objected to formally and in writing. Vane hadn't spoken to him directly. He'd spoken to the commissioners, and during the hearing, his eyes had passed over Wyatt 3 times, with the smooth indifference of a man who has already decided you're not worth addressing directly. The commission had ruled in Vane's favor on a narrow procedural technicality that Hensley later identified as having been deliberately engineered by a commissioner whose expenses over the previous year showed a pattern of unexplained supplemental income. That was the day Wyatt had told Hensley to start building the case. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger, out of the understanding that had been accumulating quietly for several years, the way silt accumulates at the bottom of a creek, that Silas Vane was not going to stop. That the boundary adjustment was one move in a strategy that had been running for years before Wyatt recognized it, that it would continue for years after if nothing interrupted it, and that the most dangerous thing about a man like Vane wasn't the ambition, or the money, or even the willingness to put bounties on people who inconvenienced him. The most dangerous thing was the patience. Vane could wait. He could let 3 years pass between the first offer on a piece of land and the mechanism that eventually forced the land's owner to sell or disappear. And he could do it with the apparent serenity of a man who has never in his life questioned whether time was on his side. Wyatt had decided sitting in that Pueblo hearing room that he was going to be more patient. He wasn't entirely sure. At 3 a.m. in a hotel chair with a bullet wound in his shoulder and a telegraph out to Denver, whether he had succeeded or whether he'd simply managed to turn something bad into something different, which was not the same thing at all. The reply from Denver arrived the following morning. Crane brought it to Wyatt at the hotel, which Wyatt took as either a professional courtesy or an indication that Crane wanted to have the conversation in a room where no one else could hear it, possibly both. The sheriff sat in the room's only other chair and read the telegram twice before handing it across. The message was from a deputy marshal named Corvin, acting on behalf of the territorial marshal who was apparently traveling. It said, in the compressed language of telegraph communication, that the office had received Crane's transmission and the documentation summary, that an investigator would be dispatched within 10 days, and that in the interim no action of a dispositive nature should be taken regarding the named parties. Wyatt read that last part twice. No action of a dispositive nature. They're telling us to sit on it, he said. They're telling us to not do anything that would compromise the investigation, Crane said, which is the same thing said in language that sounds less like sitting. 10 days, give or take. Wyatt looked at the window. The morning light was coming in flat and yellow, the kind of Colorado mountain light that was honest about what it was and didn't try to be beautiful. It landed on the floor in a rectangle and moved imperceptibly as the sun climbed. Vane's going to know, Wyatt said. He already knows something, Crane said. 3 men sent out, no report back, no body delivered. A man like Vane notices when his contractors go quiet. He has more men, Wyatt said, probably. And he has 10 days. Crane was quiet for a moment, and Wyatt understood that the sheriff had already been thinking about exactly this, had probably been thinking about it since sending the telegram the night before, had possibly not slept well because of it, because Crane was the kind of man who carried the implications of his decisions forward into the night and worried them like a stone in a pocket. I've got 2 deputies, Crane said. Blackwater Ridge is not a large jurisdiction. But it's my jurisdiction. I'm not asking you to fight Vane's men, Wyatt said. That's not the play. What is? Wyatt considered. The 10-day window was a problem, but it was also, if he thought about it carefully, which he'd started doing, the moment he read the telegram, a structure. Structures could be worked with. Vane's strength is that he operates quietly, Wyatt said. The boundary fraud, the disappearances, the payments to officials, all of it has been conducted in the spaces between public attention. He's a man who depends on nobody looking carefully. He paused. The saloon yesterday changed something. The whole town saw 3 bounty hunters come in for me. The whole town saw the aftermath. They don't know all of it. They don't know the documents, the depth of what Vane's has been doing, but they know someone sent killers after a man who stayed and didn't run. You want to tell them, Crane said. Not everything, but enough. Wyatt shifted in the chair, redistributed the weight off his left side. You have a town council? 5 members. The mayor's one of them. What kind of man is the mayor? Crane thought about it, actually thought. Didn't just answer reflexively, which Wyatt respected. Cautious, he said finally. Practical. He's been here 12 years, came out from Ohio with a hardware business and built it up respectable. He doesn't make enemies, but he doesn't bend easily when he thinks something's wrong. A pause. His name is Decker. Albert Decker. He had a land dispute with a Vane-connected operation about 3 years back that got resolved in his favor, because Decker had his paperwork exactly right. He never said much about it after, but I don't think he forgot it. Is he someone who responds better to information or to being asked for help? Crane considered this carefully too. Both, he said. In that order. I'd like to meet him today, Wyatt said. If you can arrange it. Albert Decker was a compact man of 54 with close-cropped gray hair, and the hands of someone who'd done manual work before he'd done office work and hadn't entirely stopped. He had a hardware store with a good reputation and a back office where he kept his counsel business, and he received Wyatt and Crane in that office at 11 in the morning, with coffee that was considerably better than what the saloon produced, and an expression of prepared attentiveness that suggested he'd been thinking about this meeting since Crane's visit earlier that morning. Wyatt explained it simply and without performance. He was a cattle rancher. He owned 12,000 acres along the Arroyo Creek drainage. Silas Vane had been attempting to claim his water access through fraudulent land assessments for 3 years. He'd been building documentation of that fraud, and of other frauds for 2 years. 3 bounty hunters had arrived yesterday to remove him from the equation. 2 of them were now under medical care, and 1 had left the territory. The documentation had been delivered to the territorial marshal's office. An investigator was coming in 10 days. Decker listened to all of it without interrupting. When Wyatt finished, the mayor was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in both hands, not drinking. Just turning. The way some men handle objects when their minds are working. The land assessment fraud, Decker said. Millard Pitch. Yes, I know that name. Decker set the cup down. 3 years ago, when my dispute was going through, Pitch was the recorder on the other side of it. My lawyer at the time flagged an irregularity in the boundary documentation. It was resolved in my favor, because I had my original survey on file, and it was dated and witnessed correctly. But he stopped. Something was moving across his face that was less like surprise and more like confirmation. But the irregularity was in the assessment document, which Pitch had signed. Pitch signs documents for Vane, Wyatt said. He has for at least 6 years. Decker looked at Crane. You knew this? I suspected something 3 years ago, Crane said. What I had wasn't enough to act on. What Mercer has been building is. Decker was quiet again. Outside his back window, the sounds of Blackwater Ridge's main commerce were going on: wagons, voices, the steady, ordinary noise of a working town. Decker had spent 12 years here, Wyatt knew. Had built something. Had a stake in how the ground under that stake was arranged. What do you need from the town? Decker asked. Visibility, Wyatt said. The investigator coming from Denver needs to see that this isn't one man's complaint. Vane's operation depends on isolated landowners with individual grievances who don't know about each other. If the town council is publicly aware of what's in those documents, if there are additional voices, additional records, additional corroboration, it changes the weight of what the investigator finds when he arrives. You want us to dig into our own records, Decker said. I want you to look at whether any of your council members or their neighbors have had land disputes or assessment irregularities in the last 6 years that might look different now with additional context, Wyatt said. I'm not asking you to make accusations. I'm asking you to know what you know. Decker looked at Crane again, then back at Wyatt. You came here to a town you'd never been to before, specifically to do this. I came here because I needed ground I could trust, Wyatt said, and because Vane doesn't have reach here the way he has it in Pueblo. Not yet. Not yet, Decker repeated. He seemed to hear the implication in those 2 words and sit with it. Men like Vane expand into towns like this one the same way they expand into everything else, Wyatt said. Gradually with patience until one day a council member gets an offer that's just attractive enough to take. And then there's a connection, and connections grow. He paused. I'm not saying that's happened here. I'm saying the 10 days before the investigator arrives are the last 10 days where it definitely hasn't. It was a plain thing to say, and Wyatt knew it. Not inflammatory, he wasn't trying to scare the man into action, because scared men in authority didn't make good decisions, and he needed Decker to make good decisions. Just plain. The plainest accurate version of the situation. Decker turned the coffee cup again. I'll call a council meeting for this afternoon, he said. Closed session. Can you be there? Yes, Wyatt said. Your arm, Decker said, looking at the sling. It's not my talking arm, Wyatt said. The council meeting lasted 3 hours. 5 members around a table in the back room of the town hall building, which smelled of old paper and pine tar, and the particular dry indoor smell of official spaces in frontier towns that had never quite invested in the buildings their functions deserved. Crane sat against the wall as a professional witness. Wyatt sat at one end of the table and laid out what he had, in the same clear sequential way he'd laid it out for Decker, with the same controlled energy, not passion, because passion made men defensive, but the particular steadiness of someone who has looked at the same set of facts from every angle and arrived at the same conclusion each time. The 5 council members were different kinds of men. Decker, the mayor, already briefed and already, Wyatt could see it mentally organized around what he'd been told. A cattle buyer named Prentice, who was red-faced and loud in the manner of men who confuse volume with force and who asked the most questions, not all of them good ones. A woman named Margaret Shea, who ran the town's only hotel and said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, but whose eyes never stopped moving between the speakers and whose silences had the quality of very active thought. A retired army man named Galt, who took notes in a small book without being asked to, and who at one point asked Wyatt to repeat an exact date, twice, with the focused specificity of someone who knew why dates mattered. And a younger man, late 20s, maybe 30, named Tolliver, who operated a feed supply business, and who was the only one of them who seemed to know already some piece of what Wyatt was telling them, because twice during the presentation his expression shifted from attention to recognition, and he looked at the table rather than at Wyatt. At the end of the first hour, Prentice asked whether any of this was actually the council's business, which was a reasonable question badly framed, and Decker answered it by saying that anything involving the fraudulent manipulation of land records in their county was the council's business, and if Prentice disagreed, he could take that position publicly, which put the question to rest. At the end of the second hour, Margaret Shea asked Wyatt something that nobody else had asked. When you decided to come to this town specifically, she said, and to sit in that saloon and wait for those men, did you know you were going to get shot? The room was quiet. The question had a quality that the previous questions hadn't. It wasn't procedural or legal or political. It was personal. And personal questions in rooms full of officials tended to land differently than everything else. I thought it was probable, Wyatt said. And you came anyway. The alternative was running, Wyatt said. Vane would have sent more men. Better ones, maybe. Or he would have found a different mechanism, the land records, a foreclosure, some other approach. A man with his resources and his patience doesn't stop because you make yourself hard to find. He waits. He paused. I'm 41 years old. I'm not interested in spending the next 20 years being patient about the same strum. Shay looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and made a note on the paper in front of her. Tolliver, the feed supply man, raised his hand near the end of the third hour. He had the look of a man who's been building up to something and is now deciding whether the room is safe enough. I had a dispute, he said, about 18 months ago. Boundary on my property's east side. The assessment came in showing my line 20 yards west of where I had it on my original claim. I couldn't afford the kind of legal fight that would have been required to contest it, so He stopped. I adjusted. Moved my fence. Who did the assessment? Crane asked from the wall. County man from Pueblo, Tolliver said. I don't remember his name. But the document, he looked at Wyatt. Could we check? Against what you have? Yes, Wyatt said, if it's the same signature, Tolliver said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After the meeting, when the others had gone, Decker walked Wyatt to the door of the town hall and stood on the top step in the late afternoon light and looked at the street. Tolliver's not the only one, he said, I'm guessing. Probably not, Wyatt said. I'm going to ask the others to look at their records. Quietly. Before the investigator arrives, that's all I'm asking. Decker turned to look at him. The mayor had the expression of a man who has made a decision that he knows is going to cost him something and is working out in advance what the cost is likely to be and whether he's prepared for it. Vane's going to know about this meeting, Decker said. Yes. He has someone in the territory who knows about everything. That's how he operates, Wyatt said. He knows things. He finds out things. He uses what he knows to create leverage, and then he uses leverage to create more leverage. The thing he doesn't know how to do. Wyatt looked at the street, at the ordinary afternoon business of a town that was trying to understand what had happened to it in the last 24 hours. He doesn't know what to do when the people he's been operating around start talking to each other. Decker absorbed this. He isolates, the mayor said. Individual disputes, individual landowners, never connected, Wyatt said. Never coordinating. The minute they coordinate, the pattern becomes visible. Decker was quiet for a moment. That's what this town is, he said. Not a question, if you want it to be, Wyatt said. He walked back to the hotel in the long copper light of late afternoon and sat on the edge of the bed and let the shoulder have its say for a while, which was a significant amount to say. Fenn had told him to take the laudanum if the pain became unmanageable, and Wyatt's definition of unmanageable was somewhat further along the spectrum than Fenn's. But by the time the street outside had gone quiet and the first evening stars had shown up over the ridgeline to the west, he decided that the gap between his definition and Fenn's had narrowed enough to close. He slept better the second night. Not well, but better. On the third day, 2 things happened that changed the shape of the next 7. The first was a letter delivered to the hotel, brought by a rider who'd ridden hard from the direction of Pueblo, and who handed it to the hotel desk man with instructions to deliver it to Wyatt Mercer and to nobody else. The hotel desk man, a careful and curious person who had no interest in other people's correspondence as long as it didn't require him to do anything complicated, knocked on Wyatt's door and handed it over without comment. The letter was from Hensley. Wyatt read it at the window. The handwriting was Hensley's neat, compressed, the handwriting of a man who charged by the document and had developed efficiency in everything, including his script. W. Vane knows about the box, don't know how. His man in Pueblo is a clerk named Harwood, who I've been tracking but not carefully enough, my error. He has had someone watching the mercantile in BW Ridge. What he knows about the contents I can't confirm but assume the worst. He will not wait 10 days. Suggest you move the remaining documents to a secondary location. The originals or safe copies are what matters now. Suggest you also make direct contact with the territorial office rather than relying solely on Crane's telegraph. They need to hear from you directly. Be careful. H. Wyatt read it twice, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket next to the telegram confirmation slips. He stood at the window for a moment. Then he went to find Crane. The second thing that happened was that Tolliver came to the hotel in the early afternoon with a document in his hand and a look on his face that was some combination of anger and the particular relief of a man who has had a suspicion, confirmed and can now, finally, do something with it. The document was his land assessment from 18 months ago. The signature at the bottom was Millard Pitch. It's the same man, Tolliver said. He set the paper on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile. I looked it up this morning. The handwriting, the signature style, and there's a stamp in the corner, a county recorder's stamp. It's Pitch, I know, Wyatt said. 20 yards, Tolliver said. His voice was tight. 20 yards of land that's been in my family's use for 8 years. I couldn't afford to fight it, and I thought. He stopped, pressed his jaw together. I thought I was wrong. I thought maybe I'd miscalculated somewhere. And the county was right, and I was the one who didn't have his paperwork in order. You weren't wrong, Wyatt said. 20 yards, Tolliver said again. The repetition wasn't for Wyatt's benefit. It was the repetition of a man going over something that has been bothering him for a long time and is now being allowed to bother him openly, in front of another person, which is a different kind of bothering. When the investigator comes, Wyatt said, your document goes with the others. Your testimony, your account of what the assessment did to your property line and what it cost you. He looked at Tolliver steadily. You're not the only one in this town. I don't know how many Decker's still asking, but you're not the only one. Tolliver looked at him for a long moment. He was a young man for this kind of weight, 30 maybe, with the beginning of lines around his eyes that came from squinting into weather and sun, the kind of lines that arrive early on men who work outdoors. He'd carried the 20 yards of wrong boundary for 18 months without being able to put it down, and without knowing why it had happened, and without anyone who could tell him he wasn't mistaken. What do you need from me? He asked. Same thing I needed from Decker, Wyatt said. Be available when the investigator arrives. Have your documents. Be willing to say what you just said to me. That's it? That's the most important thing, Wyatt said. Testimony from the people it happened to. Not just documents. The documents can be argued with. People's experiences are harder to argue with. Tolliver picked his assessment paper back up. He held it for a moment, looking at the signature at the bottom. Then he folded it and put it in his vest pocket and stood. My neighbor Adler had the same thing 3 years ago, he said. East side boundary, county assessment, different from his original claim. He sold out the following year. Said the land wasn't worth fighting over. He paused. I don't think he knew it wasn't an accident. Would he talk to an investigator? I'll ask him, Tolliver said. He left, and Wyatt sat for a while at the table thinking about the name Adler, adding it to the list he'd been building in his head since the council meeting. A list that was longer than he'd expected, and shorter than he suspected the reality was. For every Tolliver who'd stayed quiet, there was probably an Adler who'd left. And for every Adler who'd left, there were probably 2 or 3 others who'd left without anyone noticing the pattern in their leaving. That was how it worked. That was the particular genius of Vane's patience. He didn't take everything at once, which would have been visible and loud. He took 20 yards here, an 80-yard boundary shift there, one man's water access in one season, another man's grazing range in another season, and the cumulative effect was enormous, and the individual pieces were small enough that each one looked like ordinary administrative error rather than what it was. Ordinary administrative error. The phrase had its own particular ugliness. The way precise language applied to unjust things always had a specific ugliness, like a good clean blade used for a bad purpose. Crane's response to Hensley's letter was to spend 2 hours at the Mercantile with the strongbox and the help of Hollis, who was unhappy about the situation but not obstructive, making copies of the most critical documents. They moved those copies, Wyatt's testimony, the core evidence, the signed depositions, to 3 separate locations, one with Crane's office, one with Decker at Town Hall, one with the hotel's safe, which was a heavy iron box bolted to the floor under the desk that had survived 2 previous thefts and was probably adequate. The originals stayed in the strongbox locked at the Mercantile. If someone came for them, they'd find copies. The originals would have left the building by then. Wyatt also dictated a letter to Hensley, his shoulder made writing difficult, which went out by the next morning rider, with detailed instructions to contact the territorial office directly and request that the dispatch timeline be accelerated, given the indication that Vane had knowledge of the investigation. He wrote it carefully, with the specific factual language that official correspondence required, and added at the bottom a single personal line, "Do not underestimate how fast he moves when cornered." Because that was the thing about Silas Vane that Wyatt had been sitting with since he'd read Hensley's letter. Patient men, when they understood that their patience had been outmaneuvered, did not become slow. They became fast. The patience was a tool, not a character trait. When the tool stopped working, they put it down and picked up another one. What another tool looked like, in Vane's hands, with 10 days on the clock and a territorial investigator coming and a strongbox full of evidence sitting in a Mercantile in a town he'd previously considered irrelevant. Wyatt didn't know exactly. He had guesses. None of them were comfortable. He ate dinner at the hotel that night, alone at a small table by the window. The cook produced something with beef and potatoes that was hot and substantial, and tasted like food rather than effort, which was about the best you could say about it and was sufficient. He ate slowly and watched the street and thought about distance. Denver was 3 days hard ride or 2 days by the stage that ran twice a week, and the stage had run yesterday, which meant the next one was 5 days out unless someone hired a private coach. The territorial investigator could come faster than 10 days if the office moved. Hensley's letter would push that, but even faster meant 7 days, maybe 6. 6 days was a long time in a situation like this one. It was also not the longest thing Wyatt had ever waded through. He'd waited 2 years to get to this room and this table and this window. He had enough patience left for 6 more days. What he was less sure about was his shoulder, which had developed, In addition to the fundamental complaint of having been shot, a secondary complaint that Fenn identified the next morning as the beginning of infection, not severe, not yet, but the kind of thing that required attention and care, and the specific sullen obedience of a man who had spent the better part of 40 years treating his body as a working instrument and was now being reminded forcefully that instruments had limits. "You need to stay in bed," Fenn said. He had the resigned tone of a man who'd delivered this instruction before and not been listened to. "I need to be in Decker's office at 2 this afternoon," Wyatt said. "Your arm is still attached," Wyatt said. "That's the main requirement." Fenn cleaned the wound with something that produced a pain that made the original bullet seem, by comparison, like a polite inquiry. He repacked the bandage. He looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man who has done everything in his power and is now releasing liability. "You're going to be sick," Fenn said. "Probably in about 2 days. Fever, chills, the general sensation that the world is worse than usual." "I've had that before," Wyatt said. "Not from a bullet wound infection, you haven't." "No," Wyatt admitted. "That part's new." Decker's 2 o'clock meeting was the one Wyatt had requested to establish a line of direct communication between the council and the territorial office, separate from Crane's official redundancy that Hensley's letter had made necessary. The mayor had arranged a telegraph draft and a list of corroborating council signatures, and the meeting was to finalize the language. It was good work, methodical, detailed, the kind of bureaucratic effort that didn't feel like much in the doing but had a long reach when it arrived on the right desks. 3 people came to the meeting who hadn't been at the council session. Margaret Shea had brought a neighbor named Cullen who'd had a water rights dispute 2 years ago that had gone wrong in ways he'd never understood, and which he was now, with the help of Tolliver and the morning's conversations, beginning to understand better. And there was a woman who arrived with Tolliver, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, who introduced herself as Adler's wife, because Adler himself had left for his brother's place near Grand Junction the previous year and couldn't be reached quickly. But she had his records and his account of what had happened, and she was, she said, entirely willing to speak on his behalf. Her name was Clara Adler, and she sat at Decker's table with a folder of documents and the specific, unperformative anger of a woman who has been carrying an injustice for a long time and is now finally in a room where the injustice is being treated as real. Wyatt listened to her account. The Adler property had been on the eastern edge of Vane's targeted acquisition zone. The boundary dispute had affected their access to seasonal water, which had made the property unviable for the kind of cattle operation they'd been running, which had forced the sale. Adler had sold for 60% of what the property had been worth before the assessment. The buyer, through a series of intermediary transactions that were designed to obscure the trail, had been a landholding company whose operating funds originated from accounts connected to Silas Vane. Clara Adler laid the documentation out on the table with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent time organizing it, who'd been organizing it probably for longer than she'd known what it was for, the way people hold on to evidence of wrongs done to them, even when they don't have anywhere to bring it, because letting go of it feels like agreeing that it didn't matter. "He bought our land," she said, "for less than it was worth, after making it worth less with a piece of paper." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that's maintained through effort rather than ease. "My husband spent 15 years on that property. He built everything on it with his own hands." She looked at Wyatt. "How many others? We're still counting," Wyatt said honestly. "Is it going to matter?" "When the investigator comes." "Every name matters," Wyatt said. "Every account. Every document. What Vane has been doing is difficult to prove with 1 or 2 cases because he has lawyers who can argue individual cases into the ground. But 12 cases or 20 with the same signature at the bottom and the same pattern of acquisition following the same fraudulent assessments." He stopped. "That's not one man's complaint anymore. That's a system. And a system is what the territorial courts can act on." Clara Adler looked at her documents on the table. Then she looked at Decker, and she looked back at Wyatt. "My husband is in Grand Junction," she said. "I can get word to him in 3 days. If the investigator comes after that, he can be here." "Send the word," Wyatt said. The meeting ran until 5. By the end of it, there were 6 accounts on the table, 6 sets of documents, 6 names attached to boundary disputes or water rights manipulations or land assessments that shared a signature and a timeline and a pattern of subsequent acquisition. Galt, the retired army man who'd been taking notes since the first council meeting, had organized them chronologically on a single sheet of paper that showed the progression of Vane's operation across 5 years, with a clarity that was almost geometric. Decker looked at that sheet for a long time. "He's been moving east," the mayor said, "from the Pueblo area east and north. Arroyo Creek drainage is the furthest north he's reached." "Which is where my property is," Wyatt said. "Which is where your property is." Decker looked at the map Galt had sketched in the margin, a rough outline of the territory, with the disputed parcels marked. He's building towards something specific. It's not random acquisition. Water, Wyatt said. The creek system. Whoever controls the Arroyo Creek drainage controls the water table for about a third of the viable grazing land in this part of the territory. It's worth more than the land itself. Decker sat back. He's buying the water, he's stealing it, Clara Adler said. She said it quietly, without drama, but in the particular flat way of a statement that didn't require amplification because the facts themselves were loud enough. Nobody argued with her. That evening the rider came. He arrived at the hotel as Wyatt was climbing the stairs to his room, a man on a tired horse who'd pushed through the afternoon and into the early dark, asking for Wyatt Mercer by name at the desk. He was not a bounty hunter. He was a young man in a decent coat who carried himself like someone who delivered messages for a living and had learned to be neutral about their contents. He handed Wyatt a sealed envelope. Inside was a card with an address, a ranch property 20 miles south of Blackwater Ridge, and 2 lines of text written in the formal, clean hand of a man who dictated his correspondence. Mr. Mercer, I think it's time we spoke directly. You have been a very patient man. I respect patience. Come alone. Vane Wyatt read it once. He looked at the messenger. When did you leave? This morning, the young man said. He gave me the message at dawn. Dawn, Wyatt said. He looked at the card again, the address, the 2 lines, the initial. He asked you to wait for a reply? Yes, sir. Wyatt stood in the hotel corridor with a bullet wound that was 2 days into becoming an infection and a shoulder that had been arguing with him since the moment he'd gotten out of bed that morning, and he thought about what it meant that Silas Vane had sent this message at dawn, which was before Hensley's letter had reached anyone, which was before the afternoon meeting, which meant Vane had been reaching for this particular tool since before Wyatt knew how fast things were moving. Come alone. The 2 most dangerous words in the message. The words that told you more about the person writing them than anything else in the note. He looked at the messenger. Tell him I'll come, Wyatt said. Day after tomorrow. The messenger left. Wyatt stood in the corridor for another moment, then walked to the end of it and knocked on the door of the room he knew Crane had taken for the duration of this situation, because Crane was the kind of lawman who stayed close when things were unresolved. The door opened. Crane looked at him, then at the card in his hand. Wyatt handed it over. Crane read it. His expression moved through several stages in quick succession and settled somewhere between professional concern and the particular wariness of a man who sees a trap and is deciding how to describe it to the person about to walk toward it. You said yes, Crane said. Day after tomorrow, Wyatt said. Come alone, Crane read. I'm aware of what it says. Crane looked at him. What are you thinking? Wyatt thought about it honestly. About the 10-day window and the 6 days remaining in it. About the infection working quietly in his shoulder. About Galt's geometric map of Vane's acquisitions and Clara Adler's voice saying, he's stealing it, and the particular weight of 20 yards of boundary line and 8 years of a man's work, and the way a careful system of small thefts can take. Everything from a person, without ever looking like anything other than administrative paperwork. I'm thinking, Wyatt said, that Silas Vane just made a mistake. Crane's question hung in the corridor between them. What are you thinking? And Wyatt's answer sat in the air for a moment, before either of them did anything with it. Vane's mistake. Crane turned the card over in his hands, looking at the back of it as if there might be something on the other side that would clarify things. There wasn't. Just blank cardstock, slightly worn at the corner from the messenger's coat pocket. Explain, Crane said. He sent this at dawn, Wyatt said. Before your telegraphs got responses. Before the council meeting this afternoon. Before he could know how far things had moved. He leaned against the corridor wall, let it take some of his weight. The shoulder was making itself known in a way that required active management. He sent it because 3 bounty hunters went quiet, and he needed to understand what he was dealing with. He thought he was reaching out from a position of strength. He knows about the box. He knows about you. He knows I'm still in this town. What he doesn't know is that 6 people sat at Decker's table today with documents. Crane absorbed this, so he's still thinking it's one man. He's still thinking it's one man with a lawyer and a box of papers, Wyatt said. He's done this before, bought people out or neutralized them, before they could build enough momentum. He thinks he can sit across a table from me and find the price. And if there isn't a price, then we have a conversation that tells me exactly what he knows and what he's planning to do about it, Wyatt said. In front of a witness, Crane looked at him. He said, come alone. He said, come alone, Wyatt agreed. He didn't say anything about what I do before I come. The next morning, Wyatt woke at 5 with a fever. It was not dramatic about it, no shaking, no delirium. Just the dull, insistent heat that settles into a man's body when something inside is fighting something else and producing warmth as a byproduct. His shoulder had graduated from grinding complaint to a sharper, more specific kind of misery, and when Finn arrived at 7 and unwrapped the bandage, the expression on the doctor's face was the expression of a man whose prediction has come true faster than expected. I told you, Fen said. I know, Wyatt said. Bed rest. Today and tomorrow at minimum. I have a meeting tomorrow afternoon, Wyatt said. Fen put down the clean bandage he'd been about to apply and looked at Wyatt with the complete, unguarded exasperation of a man who has run out of diplomatic reserves. You have a bullet wound, infection, and a fever. Whatever meeting you have tomorrow is with Silas Vane, Wyatt said. Fen was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the bandage again and resumed working, because there was nothing useful to say about that, and Fen was a practical man. I'll give you something for the fever, he said. Willow bark quinine. It'll bring it down and keep it down if you take it correctly. Drink water. More water than you think you need. He tied off the bandage with more force than strictly necessary. If the fever goes above a certain point, you'll know because your thinking will go wrong. If your thinking goes wrong before the meeting, then I won't go, Wyatt said. Fen looked at him with the particular skepticism of a man who has been lied to by patients before and has developed a reliable detector for it. I mean it, Wyatt said. I'm not interested in walking into that meeting delirious. The whole point is to think clearly. Fen finished up. He left the medications with instructions that were precise enough to suggest he'd been burned by vague instructions before. At the door, he stopped. Who is he? Fen asked. Vane, the man sending you cards. He's a businessman, Wyatt said. Buys land, controls water, builds influence. And he sent 3 killers after you. He sent 3 professional contractors after me, Wyatt said. There's a distinction he'd probably want me to make. Does it matter? Wyatt thought about that honestly. Not to my shoulder, he said. Fen left. The fever stayed manageable through the morning. Wyatt drank the water. He took the medications with the mechanical regularity of a man who has outsourced certain decisions to the doctor and has decided to honor the arrangement. He stayed horizontal for 2 hours in the mid-morning, which he spent staring at the ceiling and running through the conversation with Vane in his head, not scripting it, because scripted conversations had a way of breaking down the moment the other person said something unexpected, but mapping the territory, where Vane would push, where the edges were, what he would offer, and in what order, and how Wyatt was going to respond to each of those offers without giving away how much the ground had shifted in the last 3 days. In the early afternoon, Crane came with 2 things, a reply from Judge Fitch in Colorado Springs and a man Wyatt hadn't met yet. The reply from Fitch was 6 lines, which was 4 more than Wyatt had expected from a man Crane had described as slow to respond. It said that the judge had reviewed the summary of materials transmitted by Crane, that he found the matter sufficiently substantiated to warrant judicial oversight of the territorial investigation, and that he was personally contacting the marshal's office to request accelerated dispatch. It closed with a line that Wyatt read twice. The pattern you have described is consistent with a series of complaints this office received across a period of 4 years and set aside for insufficient individual evidence. This office is prepared to revisit those complaints in light of the documentation now available. 4 years other complaints set aside. Wyatt put the reply down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Fitch has seen pieces of this before, Crane said. From other jurisdictions. He just didn't have enough to connect them, Wyatt said. Until now. The man Crane had brought was a rancher named Boone who operated a mid-sized property about 12 miles northeast of Blackwater Ridge, and who had ridden into town that morning specifically to find Wyatt, having heard from Tolliver the previous day about the council meeting. He was a deliberate, weathered man of around 50 who sat in Wyatt's hotel room chair and described, with the flat economy of someone who's told a story enough times to have stripped it of everything non-essential, a water rights dispute from 3 years ago that had cost him access to seasonal creek flow from a tributary of the Arroyo and had never been satisfactorily explained. He had his original water rights documentation. He had the county assessment that had superseded it. The signatures were consistent with everything Wyatt had seen. The man who bought the rights from the county intermediary, Boone said. I found out later it was a company called Keystone Holdings. I looked up Keystone. Couldn't find who owned it. I can tell you, Wyatt said. Boone looked at him. Vane, Wyatt said. Something moved across Boone's face that was slow and deep, and not particularly pleasant. Not surprised it had the quality of something fitting into a space that had been empty too long. My cattle operation runs on that water, Boone said. I've been dry supplementing for 3 years. It costs me $1,200 a year over what I'd spend if I had the creek access. That goes in the record, Wyatt said. The direct financial impact. We need numbers wherever we have them. It makes the case tangible. He looked at Crane. Can we add Boone to the documents going to Fitch's office? I'll ride to the Telegraph this afternoon, Crane said. Boone stayed another hour. He wasn't a talkative man, but he asked good questions, and when he understood the full scope of what had been assembled, not just his own dispute, but the 6 others, the pattern, the progression, the connection to the fraudulent boundary assessments, he went quiet for a time, in the way of a man recalculating the dimensions of something he thought he'd understood. How many people are involved in this? He said finally. On Vane's side, at minimum, Millard Pitch, the survey crew who signed the manipulated assessments, whoever operates as the intermediary for his land acquisition companies, and the people who organized the contract on me, Wyatt said. There are probably others officials in the county system who've received payment and looked the other way. On ours, Wyatt looked at him, 7 documented cases as of this morning, he said. With Fitch's office having additional complaints from other jurisdictions, I think the real number is higher. Some people sold and moved on without knowing why things went wrong. Some people in positions like yours absorbed the damage and adapted rather than challenging it. Because challenging it looked impossible, Boone said. Yes. It looked like one man against a system that had already decided. Yes, Wyatt said again. That's how it's supposed to look. That's the design. Boone was quiet. Then he said something that Wyatt wasn't expecting. My neighbor sold 4 years ago, he said. Good man. Good operation. His water access went wrong, and then his eastern boundary came in different than his claim, and then he had a debt with a local lender that suddenly got called in all at once. 3 things in 1 year. He thought he was unlucky. Boone's jaw set. He wasn't unlucky. Wyatt said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would help with that particular realization, which was not the pleasant kind of clarity, but the kind that reveals a wrong done to someone who couldn't defend against it because they didn't know it was a wrong. His name was Patterson, Boone said. He went to Kansas. I have his forwarding address from 2 years ago. It may still be good. Write it down before you leave, Wyatt said. The fever was down by evening, enough to think clearly, which Wyatt took as a conditional victory. He ate at the hotel. He read through the documents again, not all of them, just the core argument, the backbone of it, and confirmed that what he was going to walk into tomorrow was not, as Vane believed, a negotiation between one man with papers and another man with power. It was, if the next 24 hours went correctly, the last conversation Silas Vane would have from a position of confidence. At 9 in the evening, Crane came back. He had 2 things. One was the confirmation that Fitch's office had received the additional materials, including Boone's account and Patterson's name. The other was information that Crane's deputy had collected quietly through the afternoon. 2 men had arrived in Blackwater Ridge that day, on horses from the direction of Pueblo, had taken a room at the hotel on the far end of Main Street from Wyatt's, and had not been seen engaging in any of the ordinary commerce that legitimate travelers engaged in. Vane's men, Wyatt said. Probably, Crane said. I can't arrest them for arriving in town. No, Wyatt said. But you know they're there. I know they're there. Wyatt thought about it. 2 men in a hotel. Not sent to take action, not yet, or they'd have acted already, and Vane wouldn't have sent the invitation if he'd intended a simpler solution. They were here to watch, to report back, to be available if the meeting tomorrow produced results that Vane wanted acted on quickly. Have your deputies visible tomorrow morning, Wyatt said. Not aggressive, just present. On the main street, near the hotel. That I can do, Crane said. And I need one more thing before I go tomorrow. What? Wyatt told him. Crane listened. His expression moved through a couple of stages before settling into something that was not entirely comfortable, but was clearly decided. That's a significant request, Crane said. I know. If it goes wrong, the telegraph records to Denver and Fitch's office exist regardless, Wyatt said. The case exists regardless. The investigator is coming regardless. He looked at Crane steadily. What the meeting tomorrow changes is whether Vane walks into the investigator's arrival already knowing the ground is gone, or whether he walks in still thinking he can manage it. Crane sat with that all right, he said. The morning of the meeting, Wyatt's fever was gone, which he took as the body making a practical decision about timing. His shoulder was still wrong, in all the ways it had been wrong, but wrong in a stable way, a known way, the kind of wrong he could budget around. He dressed carefully. He put on a clean shirt that the hotel's laundry woman had pressed and delivered the night before. He strapped on the revolver, not because he expected to use it, but because going without it to a meeting like this would have been a statement he wasn't prepared to make. He went downstairs and had coffee and ate something, and didn't taste any of it. At 10 in the morning, he rode south out of Blackwater Ridge on the gray gelding, who was in better condition than his rider, and moved with the easy reliability of an animal that had been on enough long, purposeful rides to recognize one. The property Vane had indicated was a working ranch, or had the structure of one, a main house, outbuildings, a corral with horses that looked well kept and expensive. Someone had put money into the place without quite making it feel lived in, the way a man acquires properties faster than he can give them character. The main house was a solid 2-story structure, with a wide porch that would have looked welcoming if it were someone's home. It looked like something else with 2 men standing at the corners of it, in positions that were not casual. Wyatt rode in at an easy pace, stopped the gelding at the hitching post, and dismounted with the specific care of a man managing a damaged shoulder in front of people who are watching to see how damaged he is. He was more damaged than he was showing. He was also showing more than he was hiding. He'd thought about that on the ride and decided that walking in pretending to be fine was less useful than walking in clearly functional despite being hurt, which communicated something different, something about what it had taken to put him in this condition, and the fact that it hadn't been enough. A man came out of the house before Wyatt had finished tying the horse. He was not Silas Vane. He was a lean, efficient-looking man in a good coat who had the manner of a professional intermediary, someone who handled the preliminary portions of interactions so that the principal could arrive to a situation already organized. "Mr. Mercer," the man said. "Not a question, that's right. Mr. Vane is inside." He glanced at the sling. "He asks that you leave the weapon with me." Wyatt considered this for exactly as long as it deserved consideration, which was about 3 seconds. "No," he said. The intermediary's expression didn't change. Silas Vane put a $5,000 bounty on my life," Wyatt said conversationally. "I came to this meeting in good faith. I'm not giving up my gun in a house full of his employees." He looked at the man directly. "If he's not comfortable with that, I can ride back to Blackwater Ridge, and we can conduct this conversation through lawyers." A pause. The intermediary went inside. He came back 30 seconds later. "Mr. Vane will see you," he said. The interior of the house was what money looked like when it was spending itself on a place it didn't fully inhabit. Good furniture, some of it expensive, arranged with the precise geometric correctness of rooms that are designed to impress rather than to live in. A wide desk near the window, 2 chairs in front of it, a painting on the wall that was probably worth more than the hotel Wyatt had been sleeping in. Silas Vane was standing when Wyatt entered, which was either a courtesy or a tactical preference. Standing men controlled the geography of a room differently than seated ones. He was, as Wyatt remembered, substantial, well-dressed, with those small attentive eyes that processed what they saw faster than the rest of his face acknowledged. He looked at Wyatt's sling. "I heard about what happened," Vane said, "in the saloon. I want you to know that wasn't—" "You don't need to tell me what it was," Wyatt said. "I know what it was. I know who signed the bounty documentation. I know who arranged the contractors. I know what I was worth to you and approximately how much it cost." He crossed the room and sat in one of the 2 chairs without being invited to, because he wasn't going to stand across a desk from this man like a petitioner. "Sit down, Silas. We both know what this meeting is." Vane looked at him for a moment. Then he sat. He had the quality of a man who was recalibrating, not panicking. Vane was too experienced for panic, but adjusting his initial read of the room. "You're angrier than I expected," Vane said. "I'm not angry," Wyatt said. "Anger's a waste of good thinking. What I am is clear." He put his right hand on the desk between them, palm down. "You sent the invitation because you thought you were managing a single adversary with a box of documents and an ambitious lawyer. What you're actually managing is a territorial investigation with judicial oversight from Fitch's office, 7 documented cases of fraudulent land and water manipulation, additional complaints from prior years in other jurisdictions that Fitch is now connecting to the same pattern, and a town council that sent a corroborating telegraph to Denver yesterday." Vane's expression didn't collapse. He was too careful for that. But something shifted in the set of his jaw that was very small and very telling. 7 cases, he said. "As of this morning," Wyatt said. "There may be more by this time tomorrow. We're still finding people." Silence. The window behind Vane showed the corral and the far hills and the particular clear sky of a Colorado afternoon that didn't care at all what was happening under it. A horse moved in the corral. Everything else was still. "What do you want?" Vane asked. He said it with the directness of a man who has decided to skip the middle portion of the conversation and get to the negotiable part. "I want my boundary restored," Wyatt said. "My water access restored. The Arroyo Creek drainage boundary returned to my original claim on record in the county recorder's office, with the new assessment signed by a licensed surveyor of my choosing." Vane looked at him. And the same for every person whose land or water rights were manipulated through fraudulent assessments connected to your acquisition operations over the last 6 years." He paused. "That's the floor. That's what happens regardless of everything else." "You're asking me to unwind 6 years of transactions," Vane said. "I'm telling you what the investigation is going to produce when it runs to completion," Wyatt said. "I'm giving you the opportunity to move that direction before it's mandated. The difference between those 2 things is the difference between a man who cooperated with an investigation and a man who was prosecuted at the end of one." Vane was quiet for a longer time now. He was thinking genuinely, carefully, the real thinking of a man weighing actual costs, rather than the performative hesitation of negotiation. "The bounty," Vane said finally. "Withdrawn," Wyatt said. "Today, in writing and the documents." "Go to the investigator regardless," Wyatt said. "I can't pull them back, and I wouldn't if I could." But how you appear in those documents, whether you appear as the subject of an investigation or as someone who moved voluntarily to address the harm done, that's still something you have some control over. Vane looked at the desk between them. At nothing specific, just the surface, the grain of the wood, the arbitrary geometry of where his hands were resting. It was the look of a man examining the interior of his situation and finding it smaller than it had been the last time he'd checked. You built this case over 2 years, Vane said.
Yes.
While you were running the ranch, doing the ordinary work. Yes. And you came to Blackwater Ridge specifically to draw the contractors into a public setting. Yes. Vane looked up. Those small attentive eyes were doing something Wyatt hadn't quite seen them do before, not calculating, not managing, but actually looking. Actually seeing the man across the desk rather than the obstacle or the problem or the acquisition target. You're not like most men I've dealt with, Vane said. Probably not, Wyatt agreed. Most men either fight or they sell, Vane said. The ones who fight, they fight loud and fast, and they run out of ammunition eventually. The ones who sell— He stopped. You didn't do either. No, Wyatt said. You built something to outlast you, Vane said. If those bounty hunters had killed you in that saloon, the case still opens in 12 days. That was the point, Wyatt said. Another silence. Outside, the horse had stopped moving in the corral. The afternoon was absolutely still in the way that afternoons get in high country, when the wind drops a held-breath quality, as if the air were paying attention. Vane said, if I cooperate with the investigation, if I move to restore what can be restored, what does that look like legally? I'm not a lawyer, Wyatt said, but Fitch's office has the discretion to structure things differently for cooperating parties than for contested ones. The land transactions that can be unwound will be unwound. The ones that can't, where the land has changed hands too many times or the original owners can't be located, those may require financial remedy instead. Pitch and the surveyors who signed fraudulent documents will face their own consequences regardless. He looked at Vane steadily. I'm not in a position to promise you anything. I'm telling you what's true. Vane sat with that. I need to speak with my lawyers, he said. That's reasonable, Wyatt said. The investigator arrives in less than a week. What you do before he arrives is going to shape what he finds when he gets here. He stood. The shoulder made the transition from sitting to standing its usual complaint, which he absorbed without showing it, or mostly without showing it. The bounty document, Wyatt said. I need that today. Vane looked at him. You don't trust that I trust the document, Wyatt said. Not because I don't believe your word. Because a document is a document, and your word is a word, and in the kind of legal proceedings we're looking at, documents matter more. He held Vane's gaze. You know that better than I do. A long moment. Then Vane called for the intermediary and told him to bring paper. The document was simple, 3 sentences, Vane's signature, witnessed by the intermediary and by Wyatt himself, formally withdrawing the bounty issued through the Pueblo County Recorder's Office against Wyatt Mercer and nullifying any outstanding contracts associated with it. It would have to be filed properly, would have to be registered against the original, but as a written record of intent, signed in the presence of a witness, it had weight. Wyatt folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped, the way he'd seen Dane Rourke stop at the saloon door 4 days ago, and the echo of that was not lost on him. One more thing, he said. Vane looked at him. There's a man named Boone, Wyatt said, 12 miles northeast of Blackwater Ridge. He's been supplementing his water supply for 3 years because your acquisition of the tributary rights cost him creek access. $1,200 a year. He looked at Vane directly. That's not in the formal documents yet, but it's going in. And it's the kind of specific calculable harm that investigators find very useful when they're determining remedies. He paused. I'm telling you his name so that you know he exists. What you do with that information is your business. He walked out of the house. The ride back to Blackwater Ridge took 2 hours, and Wyatt spent most of it in the particular silence of a man who has done what he came to do, and is now waiting to see whether it holds. The gray gelding moved steadily under him, unbothered by the afternoon's heat, or the long miles, or the complicated weight his rider was carrying. The document in his coat pocket pressed against his chest with every step of the horse. It wasn't everything. It was the beginning of what everything would eventually look like, which was a different things and smaller, and at the same time not small at all. He rode into Blackwater Ridge in the late afternoon and went directly to Crane's office. The sheriff looked at him when he walked in, looked at the document he placed on the desk. Crane read it, then he looked up. He signed it, Crane said. He signed it, Wyatt said. What's he going to do? He's going to call his lawyers, Wyatt said. And then he's going to decide whether fighting is worth what fighting is going to cost him. He sat down in the chair across from Crane's desk because the ride had taken something out of him that he hadn't fully had to spare. He's a smart man, smart enough to have built what he built, smart enough to understand when the architecture has changed. Crane looked at the document again. This doesn't end it. No, Wyatt said. The investigator ends it. Fitch's oversight ends it. The 7 people with documents end it. He looked at his hands. This just takes one thing off the board. The bounty. I'd like to sleep without that particular thing on the board, Wyatt said. Crane looked at him, at the sling, at the fever tiredness still visible in his eyes, at the overall state of a man who had been running on determination and practical intelligence for 4 days, with a bullet wound going septic in his shoulder, and said nothing for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced a bottle and 2 glasses and poured without asking. Wyatt took the glass. He didn't drink it immediately. He held it the same way he'd held the coffee mug in the saloon 4 mornings ago, both hands, the warmth of it, the weight. The investigator, he said. When he arrives, he's going to need someone to walk him through the documents. Someone who knows this town and knows the people involved. I'll be here, Crane said. Decker too, Wyatt said. And Tolliver and Boone and Clara Adler. He paused. And maybe Patterson if Boone's address is still good. That's a lot of people standing in the same direction, Crane said. That's the point, Wyatt said. He drank the whiskey. It was better than the saloons. The investigator arrived on the 5th day. His name was Aldridge, Thomas Aldridge, and he came not on the stage but on a fast horse with a second one trailing, which told Wyatt before the man had said a single word that Fitch's office had taken the acceleration request seriously. He was younger than Wyatt had expected, maybe 35, with the particular quality of someone who had been doing careful, unglamorous legal work long enough to have lost the need to perform authority, and had replaced it with something more useful, which was the appearance of a man who simply intended to understand everything in the room before he made any decisions about it. He introduced himself to Crane first, which was correct. Then to Wyatt, which he did with a handshake that acknowledged the sling without commenting on it. He spent the first afternoon reading. Crane had arranged the documents at the town hall in the order Galt had suggested, chronological, with the pattern of acquisition visible from beginning to end, and Aldridge sat at the long table in the council room, with the strongbox open beside him, and worked through it with the methodical patience of someone who reads the way other men breathe, steadily and without drama. He made notes. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise and structural, about the chain of custody for the depositions. Crane answered them. Aldridge wrote down the answers and went back to reading. Wyatt sat in the hallway outside and waited, which was what he'd been doing for 5 days in various configurations and had gotten moderately better at. At 6 in the evening, Aldridge came out of the council room, closed the door behind him, and stood in the hallway looking at Wyatt, with the evaluating attention that had been continuous since he had arrived. Hensley, he said, your lawyer. Yes, he built this. We built it together, Wyatt said. He provided the legal architecture. I provided the access. The surveyor in Kansas City, Aldridge said. The one with the guilty conscience. Hensley has been in contact with him for 14 months, Wyatt said. He's willing to testify. I'll need to speak with him directly. A deposition through your lawyer is useful. Direct testimony to my office is better. I'll communicate that, Wyatt said. Aldridge looked at the closed door for a moment, as if running through something in his head. The Adler property, he said, the intermediary transactions, the land holding companies. Keystone Holdings is the primary vehicle, Wyatt said. There are 2 others named in the documents. The ownership structure is obscured, but Hensley traced the operating funds through 3 transfers to accounts that are directly connected to Vane's personal holdings. That's the weakest link, Aldridge said. 3 transfers is enough distance that Vane's lawyers will argue plausible separation. I know, Wyatt said. That's why I needed the other cases. Individual, the transfers are arguable. As part of a pattern 7 cases, all following the same sequence, all with the same fraudulent assessment signature, all followed by acquisition through the same network of companies, the argument becomes considerably harder to make. Aldridge looked at him. You thought about this carefully. For 2 years, Wyatt said. Most people, Aldridge said, when they're dealing with something like this, they come to us with one complaint and ask us to do the rest. They don't build the case and then bring it. Most people don't have 2 years and a patient lawyer, Wyatt said. And most people don't have the particular motivation I had. Which was? Wyatt considered the question. It was an honest question, not a legal one, and it deserved an honest answer. Vane was going to take my water, he said. The creek drainage feeds 12,000 acres. Without it, the ranch doesn't work, not at the scale I've built it, not the way it needs to work to support the people working on it. I have 11 hands, some of them have families. He paused. I could have fought it one dispute at a time and probably lost. He has more lawyers and more money and more patience than any one man can match on his own. So I stopped fighting individually and started building something that couldn't be fought individually. Aldridge absorbed this, and the saloon, he said. Coming here, the public setting. Witnesses, Wyatt said. And momentum. An investigation that arrives in the wake of a public event moves differently than one that arrives cold. People are already paying attention. That's a significant risk to accept, Aldridge said. Wyatt looked at his shoulder. Yes, he said, it was. Aldridge spent 3 more days in Blackwater Ridge. He interviewed Tolliver for 2 hours, with Tolliver's documents spread across the table and the investigator moving through them with the same methodical attention he'd given the strongbox. He interviewed Boone, who rode in from his property and sat across from Aldridge, with the flat economy of a man who'd been telling a story for 3 years and was finally telling it to someone with the authority to do something about it. He interviewed Clara Adler, who brought her husband's records and her own account, and who answered every question with the precise, unhesitating accuracy of someone who had lived inside the details of this for long enough that they had become part of her permanent memory. He interviewed Galt, who had served in the capacity of the council's unofficial record keeper, and who produced, from his small notebook and from memory, a chronological account of everything that had happened in Blackwater Ridge in the last 8 days, with the organized thoroughness of a man who'd spent 30 years in the army, understanding that documentation was what separated a recoverable situation from an unrecoverable one. He interviewed Margaret Shea, who said less than anyone, and whose answers were the most precise. And on the 3rd afternoon, he rode out to the property 20 miles south and interviewed Silas Vane. Wyatt didn't ask what was said in that interview. It wasn't his to know. What he knew was that Aldridge returned to Blackwater Ridge 3 hours later, with the expression of a man who has covered significant ground and the posture of someone who has arrived at a position and is now proceeding from it rather than toward it. That evening, Aldridge came to the hotel. He sat in the chair by Wyatt's window, the same chair Crane had used, the same chair Finn had used, and he looked at the street below for a moment before saying anything. Vane has retained counsel in Denver, he said, 2 lawyers. Good ones, I expected that, Wyatt said. He's not going to make this simple, Aldridge said. I want to be clear about that. What we have is strong, genuinely strong. Strong enough that his lawyers know it's strong, but the process is going to take time. Months, possibly longer. The land restoration, the financial remedies, those will move through the territorial court, and territorial courts are not fast. I know, Wyatt said. The bounty document you have is immediately relevant, Aldridge said. I'm registering that withdrawal through our office, which closes that issue cleanly. Millard Pitch is facing separate proceedings. The county has already moved on that, independent of this investigation, because Fitch's communication to the recorder's office triggered their own review. He paused. Pitch is cooperating. Wyatt looked at him. Cooperating. He's scared, Aldridge said, without particular judgment. He's a man who made a series of decisions over 6 years for money and is now looking at the consequences and has decided that cooperation is the better position. He met Wyatt's eyes. His cooperation gives us the direct connection between Vane's payments and the fraudulent assessments. That's the link your lawyer's financial tracing couldn't quite close. Pitch closes it. The room was quiet for a moment. So the case holds, Wyatt said. The case holds, Aldridge said. It's going to be argued and contested, and Vane's lawyers are going to find every procedural angle available to them. But the foundation is solid. 7 documented cases, a cooperating witness in Pitch, the surveyor in Kansas City willing to testify, Judge Fitch's oversight, and his 4 years of prior complaints now connected to the same operation. He looked at the window. The man built something over 6 years. Dismantling it takes time. But it dismantles. Wyatt sat with that. The word dismantles had a weight to it that was different from the abstract words investigation, proceedings, remedies. Dismantles was physical. Dismantles was something you could picture. Boone's water rights, Wyatt said. High priority, Aldridge said. Water rights restoration goes to the front of the remediation order. The court understands the difference between a paper boundary dispute and an active operational harm. And the people who sold, Wyatt said, Adler Patterson. The ones who left, Aldridge was quiet for a moment. That's the harder part, he said honestly. Financial remedy is possible in documented cases where the sale price can be established and the connection to fraudulent manipulation demonstrated. But it's complicated and it's slow, and some of them, the ones who sold too long ago, the ones where the trail is less direct, may not see full recovery. He looked at Wyatt. I'm not going to tell you this is going to be made whole for everyone. I don't know that it will be, I know, Wyatt said. I knew that before I started building it. Then why? Because partial is better than nothing, Wyatt said, and nothing was the alternative. He looked at the window. The street below was the ordinary evening street of a town that had gone back to its business lights and windows. The distant sound of the saloon, a wagon moving slow down the far end. Vane's operation was expanding north. My property, Boone's water rights, that was the leading edge of it. If it continued, if nobody connected the pieces in 5 years, there'd be twice as many people, with half as much as they'd had before, and none of them would know why. Aldridge listened. I'm not a particularly idealistic man, Wyatt said. I have my own land and my own operation, and I'll tell you honestly that protecting those was the primary motivation when I started building this case. But somewhere in 2 years of collecting documents and talking to lawyers and understanding the scope of what Vane was doing, he stopped, looked at his hands. You can't know what a thing really is until you see all of it. And once you see all of it, you can't pretend you only have a stake in your own piece. The room was quiet. Tolliver, Wyatt said. He thought he was wrong for 18 months. He thought he'd miscalculated, hadn't kept his paperwork right, made some error somewhere, carried that. He paused. That's not a small thing. Being made to doubt yourself over something that wasn't your fault. That's damage of a kind that doesn't show up in land records. Aldridge looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not the professional neutrality of an investigator, but something more personal, the expression of a man who has been sitting across from people for 3 days and has heard things that have settled in him in a way that work doesn't always settle. I'll do what the law allows, Aldridge said. All of it. That's all I'm asking, Wyatt said. On the 8th day, Wyatt rode home. The morning was clear and cold, the sky that particular high-altitude blue that seems closer to the eye than ordinary sky. The kind of morning that would have been straightforwardly beautiful if everything in Wyatt's body hadn't been engaged in some ongoing argument with the bullet wound and the infection and the accumulated tiredness of 8 days that had not included enough sleep or enough stillness. His shoulder, in the sling, moved with the horse's gait in ways that required periodic renegotiation. The gray gelding, unbothered by all of this, picked its way south along the road with the steady cooperative intelligence that had made Wyatt keep the animal long past when other men would have moved to younger horses. Crane had come to the hotel that morning to see him off. Not officially, not in the capacity of the sheriff walking a visitor to the edge of his jurisdiction, just as a man who had spent 8 days in close proximity to a difficult situation alongside another man, and had developed, in that proximity, the kind of regard that doesn't announce itself but is clearly present. They'd shaken hands in the street in front of the hotel. Cranes had said the investigator would be in contact with Wyatt's lawyer directly from this point forward, which was the proper channel and would serve everyone better than correspondence going through Blackwater Ridge. He'd said that if the territorial investigation produced any developments that the Blackwater Ridge Council needed to respond to, he'd send word. He'd said, after a pause that suggested he was deciding whether to say it at all, that in 9 years of being the law in this town, he hadn't often seen someone walk into a bad situation deliberately and come out of it having made the situation better for people who didn't know they needed it made better. Wyatt hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd said thank you and meant it without making more of it than it was. Decker had come too, briefly the mayor standing on the boardwalk in front of the hardware store as Wyatt rode past, raising a hand, the particular nod of a man acknowledging something that doesn't require words. Wyatt returned it. Tolliver was opening his feed store as Wyatt passed the far end of Main Street, and he looked up and held up one hand, palm out, the way people gesture to each other across distances when there's nothing left to say but the fact of the acknowledgement itself still matters. And Hector, at the Dust Devil, which was just opening for the morning, Hector stood in the doorway with a coffee cup in his hand and watched Wyatt ride past and said nothing and didn't need to. Wyatt rode out of Blackwater Ridge and into the open country south and didn't look back, because looking back at things was a habit he'd never fully developed, and because the road ahead was long and the shoulder was complaining, and the gray gelding deserved to set his own pace now that the urgency was done. He thought, on that long ride home, about what the last 8 days had cost and what they had produced, and whether those two things were in any kind of balance that a reasonable person could accept. The cost was concrete and physical, a bullet wound that was going to take the better part of a month to heal correctly, a fever that had taken 3 days from him and left a tiredness behind it that wasn't going to lift quickly, and the specific ongoing tax of pain that a shoulder injury levies against every movement of the arm and the back and the neck, all of which are more connected than a man thinks until one of them stops working right. The cost was also less concrete. He'd shot 2 men. Both of them had lived, and both of them had been in that saloon with the explicit professional intention of killing him, and he had no particular guilt about the mechanics of it. Survival was survival, and Caleb Voss and Gideon Shaw had made their own choices and experienced their own consequences. But the act of shooting a person, even a person who was trying to kill you, left a mark that wasn't physical and didn't heal the same way the shoulder would heal. It was just there. The same way certain memories were just there, not festering, not crippling, but present in the way of something that has been added to a man's accounting of himself and doesn't get subtracted. He thought about Gideon Shaw the most. The old tracker against the left wall, his chest wound, the wagon south to Santa Fe, and the daughter who didn't know what her father did for a living. He didn't know whether Gideon had made it. He'd given Crane a message to send to Santa Fe through the telegraph, no details, just an inquiry through the town's medical contact, but hadn't received an answer before he left, and wouldn't know for some time. He hoped the old man made it. He couldn't fully explain why it mattered to him. Gideon had shot him, had come to that saloon with the specific purpose of ending his life for $400, but it mattered. Perhaps because of what Gideon had said, "I'm worth more than $400. As a man, I mean." Perhaps because a man who could say that in the condition Gideon had been in when he said it was a man who still had some accounting left to do with himself, and it seemed to Wyatt that a man who still had accounting to do with himself deserved the time to do it. He thought about Dane Rourke, gone before noon that first day, riding in the direction of not here, and probably stopping until here was very far behind him. He'd think about the box in the mercantile. Wyatt guessed would carry that knowledge forward into whatever came next, the knowledge that the ground had been different than it appeared. Whether it changed anything about how Dane Rourke conducted his next 12 years was not something Wyatt could know or control. He filed it under not his business and let it go. He thought about Clara Adler, who had come to Decker's table with her husband's documents and her own steady anger, and who had said he's stealing it in a voice that carried the weight of a woman who had watched something built over 15 years get taken apart by a piece of paper. He thought about Tolliver and his 18 months of self-doubt, and Boone, and his 3 years of supplemental water costs, and Patterson and Grand Junction and all the others, whose names were in the documents, and whose experiences would, eventually, be part of what the territorial court considered when it determined what restitution looked like. He thought about what Aldridge had said. "I don't know that it will be made whole for everyone." That was the part that sat heaviest and most honestly. He was a rancher, not a judge. He couldn't make the law move faster, or make the remedies larger, or make up for the years that people had spent carrying wrongs they hadn't deserved. What he'd built was a solid, durable, carefully evidenced case that Aldridge had confirmed would hold, and what the case produced was in the hands of courts and judges and the particular grinding slowness of institutional processes that existed for good reasons, even when those good reasons were frustrating. Partial was better than nothing. He believed that. He believed it the same way he believed in the value of the fence posts he was going to put in when he got home, not because fence posts were romantic or noble, but because they were necessary, because they marked the boundary of something that belonged to someone, and because someone had to do the work of putting them in, rather than just acknowledging that they ought to exist. He arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon of the second day. The property showed itself the way it always did after an absence. First, the smell of it, the particular combination of grass and cattle and creek water that was as specific and recognizable as a voice. Then the fence lines, the posts standing at their intervals along the road. Then the main house, solid and ordinary against the hillside, with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney because Mrs. Farley, who cooked for the ranch hands, ran the kitchen on a schedule that did not adjust itself for the presence or absence of the man who owned the property. His ranch foreman, a durable man named Eccles, who had been running the daily operations of the property for 6 years and who communicated primarily through implication and economy, was standing at the corral when Wyatt rode in. Eccles looked at the sling. He looked at the overall state of Wyatt's presentation, which was not what it had been 8 days ago. He said nothing for a moment. "You get it done?" Eccles asked. "Most of it," Wyatt said. "Most of it," Eccles repeated, with the tone of a man filing information without expressing an opinion about it. "The investigation's running," Wyatt said. "The bounty's withdrawn. There's going to be a process. It'll take time. The boundary and the water rights will be addressed in the territorial court." He dismounted carefully, handed the gelding's reins to a hand who'd appeared from the barn. "Things to manage in the meantime." "Your shoulder," Eccles said. "Getting better," Wyatt said. Eccles looked at it for another moment. "Fen send anything instructions? I've been ignoring some of them." Eccles turned toward the barn. "Cattle came down off the summer range yesterday. 2 days early, weather's turning north. We're about 40 head short of last year's count. And like that they were back in it, the ordinary running arithmetic of a working ranch. The losses and adjustments and decisions that didn't stop accumulating because a man had been in a town dealing with bounty hunters and investigators and a businessman who had spent 6 years trying to take everything he'd built. That was the thing about a ranch. It didn't care about context. The cattle came down when the weather turned, 40 head short or not, and the fence posts needed setting, and the creek access needed verifying, and the fall work needed doing. And the doing of it was what the place was, not the drama of the last 8 days, not the 2 years of building the case. The ordinary, repetitive, necessary work of maintaining something you'd built in a place that made maintenance difficult. Wyatt stood in the yard for a moment after Eccles disappeared into the barn. The late afternoon light was coming across the hills to the west at the angle that made the grass look golden, and the creek was audible from where he stood. His creek, the arroyo drainage, the water that fed 12,000 acres and that some man in Pueblo had spent 6 years trying to reroute through a piece of paper. Still his. Still running. Still making the sound it had made every day for the 20 years he'd been here, before Vane was a problem, before the boundary dispute, before the bounty hunters. Just the creek going where it went. He went inside. Mrs. Farley looked at the sling with the expression of a woman who has seen men come back from things in worse condition and is reserving her alarm for truly warranted situations. She put food on the table without being asked. She asked no questions about where he'd been or what had happened, because Mrs. Farley understood that men who needed to talk about things would talk about them, and men who needed to eat would eat, and her function was to ensure the eating was available when required. Wyatt ate. He tasted this meal, which was better than the hotels and considerably better than the saloons. 3 weeks later, the letter came from Hensley. It was the longest letter Hensley had written him in 2 years of correspondence, which by Hensley's compressed standards made it practically an essay. It covered, in methodical sequence, the territorial court's acceptance of the case for formal proceedings, the preliminary injunction that had been placed on all of Vane's pending land transactions in the territory, pending the investigation's completion, Millard Pitch's formal cooperation agreement, which had been finalized by Fitch's office and included a sworn account that connected Vane's payments to 31 separate fraudulent land assessments over 6 years, the suspension of the Kansas City surveyor's professional license in his current state, a separate proceeding, which had nothing to do with the territorial case, but which had happened because Fitch's communication had reached the right people, and the beginning of a property remediation process that had been assigned to a court-appointed administrator. The letter also included, near the end, a paragraph that Hensley had clearly written last, after the legal portions were complete, in a slightly different register, the register of a man who is allowing himself a single sentence of something other than professional precision. In 30 years of practice, I have built cases that were more legally complex than this one. I have not often built one that mattered more to more people. You were right that the pattern was the argument. You were right about Blackwater Ridge. I was not certain you were right about the saloon, but I have revised that opinion. Wyatt read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, with coffee that was hot and tasted like coffee and not like anything else. He thought about the word revised. Hensley revising an opinion was a significant event. The lawyer was not a man who arrived at positions casually, which meant he didn't abandon them casually either. For Hensley to say he'd revised his opinion about the saloon was Hensley's version of saying what you did worked. What he'd done had worked. Imperfectly, it was going to take months of court proceedings, and the outcome for some of the people who'd sold and left was still uncertain, and the grinding institutional slowness of remediation was going to cost Tolliver and Boone and Clara Adler's patience for considerably longer than anyone would prefer. But the case held, the injunction was in place. Vane's expansion was stopped. He set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the fence line visible from here, at the hills beyond it and the sky above them. He thought it's about something Decker had said at the end of their last meeting, when the council had gathered one final time before Aldridge left town. The mayors had said, standing in the doorway of the town hall, with the late afternoon light behind him, "I've been in this territory 20 years. I've watched powerful men take what they wanted because the people they took from didn't know about each other." He'd paused. "I don't think I knew how much that bothered me until somebody showed up and did something about it." Wyatt had thought about that on the ride home, and he thought about it again now. The loneliness of a single complaint. That was what Vane had built his operation on, the isolation of each individual harm, the careful architectural separation of one grievance from another, so that the person experiencing it believed they were alone in it, believed it was an error, or bad luck, or something they'd done wrong, or just the way things worked in a territory where powerful men had more resources than ordinary ones. That loneliness was not accidental. It was the point. A man who knows he's been wronged and knows other men have been wronged in exactly the same way, by exactly the same mechanism, is a different kind of problem than a man who thinks he was just unlucky. One man can be waited out or bought out or scared out. 7 men with documents coordinating in a room are something else entirely. That was what the saloon had been about. In the end, not just the evidence, not just the witnesses, not just the momentum of a public event. It had been about making a thing visible that had been designed to be invisible. Walking into a room that anyone could see into and saying, "Here I am, here is what I'm doing, and I'm not doing it alone." The fence posts were still in the barn, waiting. Wyatt finished his coffee, wrapped his arm, put on his coat. He went and got the posts. The southeast corner of the property, the corner that butted against the Arroyo Creek drainage, the 80 yards that Millard Pitch's fraudulent assessment had tried to move on. A piece of paper was a 40-minute ride from the main house. Wyatt made it in 50, because the shoulder still had opinions about pace, and the gray gelding had the patience for it. The ground along the fence line was hard-packed clay and creek gravel, the kind of ground that made setting posts work in the proper sense of the word. His left arm was not going to be driving anything. He'd brought Pettis, the ranch hand who'd originally carried Hensley's letter, and Pettis was a young man of 22 with 2 functioning shoulders who understood the job without needing it explained. They set the posts in the afternoon. 2 of them at the intervals the original survey had established the actual survey, the one with the real boundary, the one that was now being submitted to the territorial court as the correct record of where Wyatt Mercer's property ended and everything else began. The creek ran below them while they worked. Wyatt could hear it from the fence line, the arroyo at its fall level, lower than summer but clear, moving at the unhurried pace of water that has been doing the same thing in the same place for considerably longer than any of the humans arguing over it had been alive. It didn't know about Silas Vane. It didn't know about boundary adjustments or fraudulent assessments or territorial courts or a strongbox in a mercantile in Blackwater Ridge. It just ran, the way it had always run, and the sound of it was the same sound Wyatt had fallen asleep to every night for 20 years on this property. When the posts were set and Pettis had packed the ground around the bases and done the work that needed 2 good arms, Wyatt stood at the fence line for a moment and looked south along the creek. The land was what it had always been. The creek was what it had always been. The hills beyond them were indifferent and old, and were going to be there long after the territorial court finished its proceedings, and long after Silas Vane's lawyers finished their arguments, and long after Wyatt Mercer had finished whatever it was. He was going to finish with the years remaining to him. He wasn't a man given to large thoughts about legacy or meaning. He was a rancher. He understood things in terms of what they produced and what they cost, and whether the accounting made sense over time. What he'd spent in the last 2 years and the last 8 days had produced a result that was real and partial and imperfect and ongoing, and the accounting was roughly correct, even accounting for the shoulder, he thought, standing at the fence line, about what it cost to let things go wrong and what it cost to not let them, about the particular kind of damage that accumulates in a person who has been wronged and told, implicitly or explicitly, that the wrongness is their fault or their problem, or just the way things are. About Tolliver carrying 18 months of false doubt, about Boone paying $1,200 a year for water that had been taken by a piece of paper, about the Adler property and 15 years of work and 60% of its worth. None of those people had deserved what happened to them, and none of them had been in a position to stop it alone. That was the thing. Not that Wyatt Mercer was exceptional, or particularly brave, or possessed of some rare quality that allowed him to do what other men couldn't. He wasn't. He was a stubborn man with resources and a patient lawyer, and the specific motivation of someone whose livelihood was directly threatened. He'd built the case because he had to. He'd come to Blackwater Ridge because running wasn't a solution. He'd sat in that corner table and waited because the alternative spending years being maneuvered into smaller and smaller positions by a man with more patience was worse than a bullet. The difference was that he hadn't done it alone. That was the real thing. The case was built on other people's testimony, other people's documents, other people's willingness to sit at Decker's table and say what had happened to them. Without Tolliver and Boone and Clara Adler and Galt's careful notes and Crane's steady judgment and Hensley's 2 years of quiet work, without all of that, the strongbox was one man's complaint. With all of that, it was a case. People think power is about the person at the center of it, the man with the resources, the man with the reach, the man like Silas Vane, who has built an operation over 6 years by being smarter and more patient than the people around him. And power is about that partly. But it's also about isolation. Power depends on the people it operates against not knowing about each other, not coordinating, not understanding that their individual experiences are pieces of a larger pattern that would be legible if they could only see it from the right angle. Take away the isolation and the power changes shape. That was what Wyatt had spent 2 years building, not a legal case exactly, though the legal case was real and solid and was going to matter enormously to the people whose land and water it addressed. What he'd built was a connection between people who hadn't known they were connected, between experiences that had been kept separate by design. Pettis said something about the light going, and Wyatt came back to the fence line, to the creek sound, to the ordinary late afternoon of a working ranch in the Colorado Territory. "Let's go in," Wyatt said. They rode back to the main house in the long golden light, and the creek ran behind them, and the new fence posts stood at their intervals along the southeast boundary. 2 pieces of ordinary wood doing the ordinary work of marking where something belonged and where it ended. Not heroic, not permanent in any cosmic sense, but solid for now and set with good hands and standing in the right place. That was enough. That had always been, if a man was honest about it, the most that any of it could be. You did the work that was in front of you. You did it with whoever was willing to stand alongside you. You built things that could outlast the moment they were built for, because moments were temporary, and the things built in them were what remained. And then you went home. And the creek ran, and the cattle settled in for the night, and the smoke rose from Mrs. Farley's kitchen chimney, and somewhere south of here a territorial court was beginning the long grinding work of making something right. And somewhere north of here the Dust Devil Saloon in Blackwater Ridge was alive, with the ordinary noise of an ordinary evening, the people in it no longer behind locked doors, moving through their town with the specific ease of people who have been reminded that the thing they were afraid of has a name and a weakness, and is neither inevitable nor permanent. And Wyatt Mercer rode home in the fading light, with his arm in a sling, and his shoulder still arguing, and his fortune intact, and the water running where it was supposed to run, thinking about fence posts, and 40 head of missing cattle, and whether the south pasture grass was going to be sufficient through winter. He was not a legend. He was a rancher with a bullet wound and a case in the territorial court, and 11 hands whose families depended on the operation he'd built and defended. He was, on the evidence of the last 8 days, exactly enough.